The ruins of the Black Wall, once an impregnable fortress, now stood as a silent testament to the might of the Imperial Union. What was once a symbol of Volantine supremacy now lay in ruin, cleared by men and women who toiled to reshape their future. Lord Illyrian watched the scene with unease, but he clenched his jaw and pressed forward. His people depended on him. House Illyrian will rise again, he muttered under his breath. But rebuilding the wall was only one piece of the puzzle. At the harbor, former slaves were taking their first uncertain steps into freedom, struggling to adjust to a world that no longer saw them as property, but as equals. Most of them stood in stunned silence, their expressions caught between disbelief and wonder. Freedom was a foreign concept, and helping them adjust was a painstaking process, one that required patience, guidance, and empathy, traits that had been absent in Volantis for centuries. In the shadows of the city, Imperial soldiers worked to dismantle the remnants of the underground slave trade, hunting down slavers who had escaped justice. Maximus understood that Volantis would never be truly free so long as its old networks of oppression still existed. This war wasn't just about battles. It was about eradicating the poison that had infected the city for generations. The 3-month plan. Before leaving for Slaver's Bay, Maximus had set a 3-month plan to secure Volantis before his next campaign. The Navy would be expanded, with new ships constructed to bolster Imperial control over the seas. The army would be reinforced, preparing for the conquest of Slaver's Bay. Political control would be cemented, ensuring the loyalty of the city before moving forward. Meanwhile, news of Volantis' fall had already reached Slaver's Bay, sending shockwaves through the region. The great masters of Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen had convened in urgent meetings, their voices filled with tension and unease. The Battle of the Rhoyne had been a complete massacre. No one returned. The fear that gripped them was unmistakable. They spoke of raising more armies, fortifying their cities, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Slaves were worked to the brink, and even those who had never held a blade were being forced into military service. But the 3 cities were not alone in their fear. In the cities of Mantares, Illyria, and Tolos, the ruling elites were growing restless. Just months ago, when the 3 cities marched to war, these rulers had seen no reason to join them. They had thought the Imperial Union was nothing more than a group of savages, easily crushed. But now, as reports of the 3 cities' utter defeat reached them, their confidence wavered. Whispers filled their halls, and in their secret meetings, fear clung to their every word. "They're monsters," one master in Tolos muttered, his fingers trembling over the edge of his robe. "We've all heard the stories." Another master scoffed. "Monsters or not, they are not Valyrians. I will not bow my head to them." And so, the cities of Mantares, Illyria, and Tolos reached a consensus. They would ally themselves with the 3 cities and prepare to defend against the Western invaders. A city reborn. Far from the fearful whispers of his enemies, Maximus stood over a grand war table, a map of Essos stretched before him. Volantis was still recovering from its fall, but in his eyes, it was a blank canvas, ready to be redrawn in the image of the Imperial Union. The Black Wall, once a symbol of aristocratic oppression, was now being rebuilt under his rule. Slavery was systematically dismantled, and a new order was being established. The Red Priests, along with their fanatical fiery hand, had been eradicated, ensuring that no future religious uprising could threaten his rule. In their place, Maximus planned to erect a temple dedicated to Mother Rhoyne, creating a new faith to replace R'hllorès influence. But R'hllorès followers would not be persecuted outright. Instead, the religion was branded hostile, stripped of its rights to build temples, openly preach, or spread its ideology. They were allowed to believe, but silently. Maximus needed unity. He needed loyalty, not fragmented allegiances to a foreign faith built on blood sacrifice. A shadow's warning. His thoughts were interrupted as Faraday, his master of shadows, entered the chamber. "Your Excellency, I have urgent news." Maximus turned, his eyes narrowing. "Speak." The three cities have begun amassing forces. Faraday's expression was grim. They see the fall of Atlantis as only the beginning. They believe we intend to conquer all of Essos, and they are preparing for war. Maximus exhaled, his fingers drumming against the table. Do they truly believe they can stop us? They believe they must, Faraday replied. And they have the wealth and resources to make it a costly fight. Maximus stared at the map, his mind calculating every possible move. If we strike too soon, we risk uniting them into one force. But if we wait too long, their alliance will solidify. His jaw tightened. We need to act, but not with brute force. Faraday raised an eyebrow. What do you propose? A smirk crossed Maximus's lips. We take away what they fear losing most, power. He leaned forward, tracing his finger over Slaver's Bay. Trade is their lifeblood. Their power doesn't come from their soldiers. It comes from their control over wealth, slaves, and commerce. We will strangle their economy before we ever march to their gates. Faraday's eyes gleamed with understanding. You want to disrupt their trade routes? Not just disrupt, cripple. Maximus's voice was cold and sharp. We will steal their merchant ships, sink their supply lines, burn their grain stores. Let them feel their empire crumble beneath their feet before we ever set sail. And when they are desperate, when they make a mistake, that's when we strike. Faraday nodded, impressed. A campaign of disruption. We force them into desperation before the real battle even begins. Maximus grinned. Exactly. The Dawnborn rise. Meanwhile, in Heaven's Reach, the Imperial legions were already marching toward Volantis. They were the backbone of the next campaign, prepared to break Slaver's Bay and shatter the old order once and for all. Among them marched the Dawnborn, formerly unsullied, now reborn as free warriors. These men, once slaves, now fought as citizens of the Imperial Union. For some, war was all they knew, and they had chosen to fight for a cause greater than themselves. For freedom, for vengeance, for a world reborn. As the armies assembled and the war in the shadows began, one thing was certain. The Imperial Union was coming, and the slavers of Essos would not survive what was to come. Seated in the grand halls of a former Triarch's palace, Maximus sifted through the rewards he had earned from conquering Volantis and its surrounding territories. The opulence of the room, once a display of the city's aristocratic dominance, was now simply a backdrop to the immense power at his disposal. As his eyes scanned the glowing interface of the system, a smirk formed on his face. The rewards were far beyond his expectations. Completed quests and rewards. Heavy checkmark conquer Selharis. 30,000 system points. 200 Mumikil, towering war beasts, near impervious to conventional weapons. A single charge from them could shatter entire formations. Heavy checkmark conquer Valisar. 30,000 system points. 500 Blackguard of Nagarond, elite warriors from the Warhammer verse, clad in dark armor, fanatically loyal, and known for their ruthless efficiency in battle. Heavy checkmark conquer Voluntaries. 30,000 system points. 100 Black Wings, Nazgul birds / fell beasts. Monstrous, winged creatures capable of immense speed and terror-inducing screeches, perfect for aerial dominance. Heavy checkmark conquer Volantis. 60,000 system points. Magic ability unlocked. With training, Maximus could wield various elemental magics, his power only growing with proficiency. 5,000 heavy dwarven infantry, stout, heavily armored warriors, unshakable in battle. Heavy checkmark bonus quest. Establish control over the Roin. 10 griffin mounts, fierce, winged beasts capable of aerial combat. More available for purchase. 1x powerful character summon. Maximus leaned back, staring at the tremendous hall of power now at his fingertips. For a moment, he was glad he was alone in the chamber. If any of his men saw the wild grin on his face, they might think their emperor had lost his mind. With 150,000 system points earned and a host of new elite forces, his army was becoming a force that not even the so-called free cities of Essos could withstand. But first, the summon. A legendary summon, Merlin. With a single press of the summon button, The air shimmered with energy, filling the chamber with a blinding glow. The light swirled, coalescing into a single figure standing before him. When it faded, a voice graceful yet commanding echoed through the room. "My lord, I am Merlin, your loyal servant from now until the end of my days." Maximus raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Merlin, the legendary sorcerer of Arthurian legend. Only this time, Merlin was female. With long silver hair cascading down her shoulders, piercing blue eyes filled with wisdom and mischief, and robes adorned with arcane sigils, she exuded power. "Rise, Merlin," Maximus commanded. "Your magic and counsel will be invaluable in the battles to come." Merlin gracefully stood, nodding. "I shall serve you in all things, my emperor." Maximus smirked. "Good. I will officially appoint you to a position soon. For now, consider yourself my personal assistant." Her lips curled slightly in amusement. "An honor, my lord. I shall ensure that you are well advised and well guarded in the realm of the arcane." Maximus knew having a being of Merlin's caliber by his side would change everything. But there were more matters to attend to. Summoning an army. "Follow me." Maximus gestured to Merlin before striding toward the doors. The Imperial guard stationed outside immediately snapped to attention as he emerged. "She's with me." His tone left no room for question. Without hesitation, the guards formed up around them, escorting him through the busy streets of Atlantis. Despite the recent conquest, the people were quickly returning to daily life. Trade continued, merchants shouted their wares, and the city hummed with cautious activity. The old Volantine currency was still in use, but a new imperial bank was set to be established within the next few months. Until then, the former currency would remain valid for 5 years before being phased out entirely. Boarding his personal carriage, Maximus set off toward one of the former military staging grounds of the Tigers, now repurposed for his new army. 20 minutes later, the carriage arrived at the vast training grounds. Away from prying eyes, it was the perfect place to unleash his newest forces. Merlin watched silently, curious as to what her new emperor was about to do. Maximus stepped forward and activated the system. The ground trembled. The arrival of legends. The Mumikil, 200 units. The first summon brought forth 200 monstrous Mumikil, their sheer size and presence shaking the earth. The Imperial guards gawked in disbelief. Each war beast was as tall as a small fortress, with massive curling tusks that could skewer cavalry and trample through entire formations of infantry. With thick, near-impenetrable hides, arrows and blades would be useless against them. Even Merlin's eyes widened slightly at the sight. The Black Guard of Nagorond, 500 units. With another command, 500 black guards materialized, clad in obsidian black armor. Their eyes burned with discipline and malice. Some wielded long spears and blades, while others gripped enormous halberds, their presence alone exuding dread. Even the Imperial guards took a step back. These warriors would answer only to Maximus, and their loyalty was absolute. The Black Wings, 100 units. With a screeching cry, monstrous black wings, Nazgul-like fell beasts, took to the sky. Their ragged wings spread wide, their serpentine necks twisting as they screeched, filling the air with raw terror. Merlin hummed in approval. Formidable aerial creatures. "I approve." Maximus smirked. "I knew you would." These beasts would become the backbone of the Imperial Air Corps, their terror-inducing presence alone enough to shatter enemy morale. Heavy dwarven infantry, 5,000 units. Finally, the dwarven warriors emerged, short but stocky figures clad in plated armor. Their shields gleamed, their swords sharpened, and their expressions unyielding. Though they lacked the towering presence of the Mumikil, they would hold the line against any foe, refusing to yield ground. Orders and deployment. With his forces assembled, Maximus issued commands. The dwarven infantry would establish a military camp on site, training for the battles ahead. The Mumikil were relocated to the city's outskirts, where their handlers would ensure their discipline. The Black Wings would be transferred to Nixera's Roost, becoming part of the Imperial Air Force. The Black Guard of Nagaronde would be stationed near Maximus's quarters, a silent, lethal addition to his personal defense. The Griffins were granted free flight, as long as they were well-fed and controlled. A glimpse of war. As Volantis citizens watched in awe and unease, the future was being shaped. This was not the Volantis of old. This was the heart of an empire in the making. And soon, the slavers of Essos would feel the full might of the Imperial Union. Slavers' Bay would fall, and Maximus would not stop there.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
King's Landing. Current year, 287 AC. Sitting within the small council chamber, the members of the small council sat in wait for King Robert to arrive. A few minutes later, King Robert, who had been drinking heavily the previous night, had arrived, followed by his Kingsguard. Swaying slightly, he rumbled into the room, the heavy thud of his boots echoing off the walls. A heavy sigh left Robert's lips as he sank into his chair at the head of the table. "What news from Essos? How goes the negotiations with the Emperor?" Robert asked, looking at Jon Arryn. "From a message I just received. It seems that Lord Tyrell and Ser Davos have yet to meet directly with the Emperor because of the current war going on against slavery in the region," informed Jon Arryn. "I did hear about that. The Imperials are waging war against the slavers. But what does this have to do with the Emperor?" Robert asked, confused on how a war would make it difficult to see the Emperor. "It's because the Emperor himself is leading the war effort and is away from the capital. So far, Lord Tyrell and Ser Davos has only been able to meet with Vizier Eonwe, who holds a relatively high position within the Imperial Union, but have not managed to make any more progress than that," stated Jon Arryn. Grand Maester Pycelle, who is not known for his patience, did not take this news well. "My king," he finally spoke, his voice dry due to old age. "This emperor, he has dragons if the rumors are to be believed, houses the remaining Targaryen family members, and now he refuses to even meet our envoys? It is a slight, a clear insult to your rule." Robert frowned, his hand reaching for the cup of wine in front of him. After taking a sip, he responded to what Pycelle said. "That may be true, Pycelle," he admitted while wiping some of the stains of the wine from his mouth. "However, the reality remains. We must tread carefully. Dragons haven't been seen for over 100 years. Just the rumors of dragons, which have been confirmed to be true by Varys Littlebirds, forces us to watch our actions." Stannis, who was quiet, had chimed in, offering more information on the matter. "There are more than just dragons. There are apparently strange creatures, as well, people who can utilize magic." Everybody's eyes turned to Varys upon hearing this. "Indeed," Varys stated. "Lord Tyrell reported that he saw a dragon more massive than even Aegon, the Conqueror's dragon, Balerion. Despite this sounding ridiculous, my little birds have also whispered the same things, making it hard to not believe that such a massive dragon exists." The council fell into silence, each trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of what was being relayed. The rest of the meeting was filled with long discussions over what they should do now that they are more than certain that Maximus has dragons. In the end, it was decided to continue focusing on improving their relationship, establishing trade between them and the Imperial Union, and learning more about what the Imperial Union was capable of. Volantis. It has been 3 months since Maximus completed his conquest of the Volantis region and accepted his rewards. From those rewards, he earned a total of 150k system points, which when merged with his previous amount brings him to 236,650 total system points. With this massive number of points, he decided to buy 2k high elf archers for 30k system points to reinforce his army's range capabilities. Now he had the Dothraki riders who wielded archers on horseback with elven archers who could rain down arrows on enemies from a farther range than the Dothraki riders could. Now marching through the gates of Volantis, Maximus was standing beside Nyxera as she laid on the ground beside him. In front of them, the Eternal Legion, which is Maximus's own royal army, marched forward. 100k soldiers made up of very diverse soldiers marched together as one. Above the Legion, the Griffins and Black Wings flew overhead, creating shadows on the ground below. After them were the Mumakil, shaking the ground beneath their heavy footsteps, and the dwarven infantry marched in disciplined ranks. Merlin was flying overhead on one of the griffins as she was placed in charge of the other flying creatures, since as of now, they didn't have any riders that were trained. The long line of soldiers continued to pour out of the city, leaving a garrison of 10,000 soldiers to continue enforcing order within the city. The Shadow in Hand had a major presence within the city to ensure that the noble families and people didn't attempt to overthrow imperial rule. Back to Maximus. Standing next to him and Nyxera was Lilith and her subordinate witches who were all assigned a griffin to ride. Once most of the legion had passed, Maximus got on top of Nyxera, who continued to lay her head on ground. Maximus's voice lowered to a whisper as leaned down towards Nyxera's head. "Ready, Nyxera?" With a slight rumble from Nyxera, she lifted her head off the ground. "Are we finally going to get rid of those slavers?" she asked. "Yep, the time has finally come," he responded. "What about those other cities to the west that practice slavery?" She questioned, since if they're going to go hard against the practice of slavery, then they might as well look to the other cities. "Those cities' time will come. In fact, after this war, I will send Alexander to conquer those cities and end the practice of slavery. It's about time," she muttered, flexing her massive wings in response. "Agreed." Maximus nodded. In the next moments, Nyxera had took off from the ground, her wings causing a strong gust of wind to form. Seeing Nyxera take off, the marching soldiers had started yelling battle cries as Maximus flew overhead. They're finally going to get rid of those slave masters and slavers, who forced thousands of people to attack their empire. The overall morale was high, and they were prepared to die if needed. The Gulf of Grief is a large gulf leading into Slaver's Bay off the southern coast of Essos. For the past 3 months, the Gulf has been blocked by the Imperial Navy under the command of Admiral Thorne. Using the new ship of the line's ships, she blockaded the Gulf, preventing Slaver's Bay from continuing their slave trade with the other free cities such as Myr, Lys, and Tyros, as well as the Far East. In the span of 3 months, dozens of ships have been boarded and captured, freeing thousands of slaves and arresting dozens of slavers. The Masters Alliance, which encompassed not only Astapor, Marine, and Yunkai, but also the cities of Manteres, Illyria, and Tolos, had created a fleet which was made up of purchased merchant vessels converted into military ships. They used this fleet to try and break the blockade 2 times so far. Both times they failed, losing a total of 200 ships while the Imperial Navy only lost 5. Admiral Thorne was standing on the deck of her flagship called the Imperial Fury, which is a massive first-rate ship that weighed 2,000 tons, was 55 meters long, had a crew of 1,000 sailors, and contained around 140 guns. It was a massive behemoth of a ship that had sunk 32 of the 200 enemy ships so far. Alongside the Imperial Fury were 3 second rates, 10 fourth rates, 25th rates, and 56th rates for a total of 83 ships. When compared to the Masters Alliance fleet, its size was lacking, but it more than made up for it in its technology and firepower. She was facing the direction of where Slaver's Bay was at to watch for any incoming enemy ships. As an admiral, normally one would find her in a cabin doing some paperwork or just relaxing until the enemy showed up, but she found that to be boring and preferred to stand amongst her men whom she has earned the respect and loyalty of since her appointment as admiral. Standing next to her was Vice Admiral Garrick, a man whom she appointed herself after he proved himself in both the Battle of the Rhine River and the Battle for Volantis. Taking her gaze from the horizon, she turned to her right. "Garrick," she called, "ensure every ship is ready for another attack. I have a feeling they're going to try and break through a 3rd time." "Aye, Admiral," responded with a nod before briskly departing to delegate the orders. He ordered a sailor to hoist the solid white flag, which is used to call attention from all ships in the fleet to signal a general message or upcoming order. In addition to this, a bell was also ring, prompting several other ships to ring their bell to get the attention of those ships that were far from the flagship. After the solid white flag came the solid green flag, which signaled the rest of the fleet come to 100% readiness and prepare for a potential battle. Once the green flag was raised, The rest of the ships followed suit while Garrick returned to Admiral Thorne's side to update her as she was looking through her telescope. "The fleet has received your orders, ma'am, and should be ready within the next 4 minutes," informed Garrick. This was the time limit that they were trained to meet in order to increase their response and readiness in case of emergencies. Thorne put down her telescope for a second to look around and see majority of the other ships already raising their green flag in response to her orders, which indicated that their ship was ready for action. "Good, because the enemy are already making their move again," she replied, handing the telescope over to Garrick, who took a look himself. He saw the Master's Alliance fleet approaching with slaves tied to the bow of the ship to try and decrease the morale of the Imperial Navy. "What utter savages!" Garrick said out loud as he saw slaves tied up looking malnourished and already on the brink of death. He handed the telescope back and clasped his hand together in prayer. "I pray that the sea spare these poor souls and offer them retribution against these slave masters," he murmured, his voice heavy with sympathy. He didn't worship any god. Instead, he worshipped the sea and wanted to be a sailor for as long as he could. Admiral Thorne's expression hardened as she took the telescope back from Garrick. Her eyes narrowed on the approaching ships. The Master's Alliance fleet had been using these despicable tactics ever since the blockade started, tying slaves to the bows of their ships, using them as human shield to deter the Imperial Navy from engaging in battle. Thorne had seen this strategy before, but she knew her duty and could only avenge those who suffered during this war so that the remaining slaves could be free. "These slavers believe they can manipulate our humanity," she said, her tone cold. "But they forget we have no mercy for those who trade in human misery." She turned and raised her hand, signaling to the signal officer on the deck. The officer immediately called for the red flag, indicating that the fleet was to prepare for battle. "Ready the guns and man the sails," she commanded. "Let's show these masters what freemen can do against tyranny." The sailors cheered at her words for a quick moment before swiftly springing into action, uncoiling ropes and adjusting the sails. The cannons were prepped and primed, their massive barrels pointing toward the enemy. The ship rocked slightly as the wind picked up, and the crew members tightened their grips on the ropes, waiting for Thorne's signal. Vice Admiral Garrick stood by her side, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Admiral, do we strike first, or wait for them to come closer?" Admiral Thorne thought for a moment before she responded. "I think this time we will strike first," she said, raising her sword in the air. Within the space between the two fleets, storms began to gather, and the waves rose higher. Lightning lashed out across the sky, casting an eerie glow upon the raging sea. The power of magic was evident, and this would be her first time showcasing it in front of the enemy. After all, they've already been warned twice. Garrick nodded and turned to the gunners. "You heard the Admiral, men. Prepare to fire on my command." The sailors waited anxiously, their fingers eager to fire the cannons, and their eyes followed the storms which began to form. The enemy fleet, seeing these storms appear out of nowhere, knew that the Imperials had to be the cause of this and try to turn around, but they were in her domain now and didn't have time to escape. The storms began to hover over the Master's fleet, lightning striking the decks of a few ships, water sprouts rising from the sea like monstrous tendrils, lashing out at the ships and dragging them down. The sight was nothing short of terrifying. Admiral Thorne's voice rang out amidst the chaos. "Fire!" The cannons of the Imperial Fury roared in unison, and the first salvo ripped through the air with a deafening boom. The blast echoed across the water as the massive, iron balls tore through the air, striking the hulls of the closest slaver ships with brutal precision. The force of the cannonballs sent plumes of water high into the air, and the first line of ships in the Master's fleet, a few converted merchant vessels, were sent spiraling to the depths with a catastrophic explosion. The Imperial fleet followed suit, their cannons tearing into the slavers' ships, sending another wave of destruction through their ranks. The wind whipped around them, and the storm that had been summoned by the magic of the Imperials grew even fiercer. Dark clouds swirled above, casting the battlefield in a sinister shade of black and gray. It was as though the sea itself was on the side of the Imperial forces. "Look at them scatter," Garrick muttered under his breath, a mixture of awe and disdain in his voice. They thought they could break our blockade with these tricks. They underestimated us, Thorne replied, her voice cold and calculating. Her eyes tracked the chaos on the water. They thought we would hesitate. Now, they will learn what happens when you challenge the might of the Imperial Navy and stand against His Excellency. As the Imperial ships advanced, the Master's fleet attempted to fight back. They fired their own catapults and ballistae, but nothing they fired hit as it was hampered by the storm. In the end, the Master sent 400 ships to try and break the siege, but none of them returned, leaving thousands to drown. It was another easy victory for the Imperial Navy, which suffered 0 losses and dished out maximum damage. 1 month later, the Eternal Legion had successfully marched through the Demon Road, which is one of the famed roads built by the Valyrians during the height of their empire. The Demon Roads are made of fused black stone, a hallmark of Valyrian construction, and are exceptionally durable. The name reflects the fear and dark reputation surrounding Valyria after its destruction, as the ruins are considered cursed and dangerous. The Eternal Legion didn't encounter anything cursed or dangerous as they marched through the Demon Road, but from above, Maximus on top of Nyxera saw the remains of the old Valyrian cities and what type of dangers lurked within the ruined region. The remains of towering structures now succumbed to the surrounding nature. The forests had grown wild, with dense green foliage creeping over the stonework, hiding the towering structures that once dominated the city. Alongside this, he saw movements of shadows within the ruins, hinting at potential threats that lived within them. He referred to them as shadows because he was too high in the sky to get an accurate description of what he saw, and he wasn't willing to risk his or Nyxera's life to test just what dangers resided in the ruins. For the moment, he just watched from above, hoping to see if all the danger stories were true or not. He still didn't know if they were true, but even Nyxera was cautious of the ruins, which meant a lot considering how powerful she was. I sense an ominous presence down there. Perhaps some of those stories we have heard are true, said Nyxera. She had heard a few of the soldiers talking about the Demon Road, telling stories about the strange things that have happened to people traveling on the Demon Road. As interested as I am, I don't want to find out what lurks in these ruins just yet. In the future, however, I will come back to claim this land for its ancient history and the value it will provide once it's reclaimed. Maximus replied, the lands of Old Valyria is not a priority for him at the moment, nor does he have an interest in reclaiming it at the moment when he has other things that he wants to do. After passing the Demon Road, the Eternal Legion had come across one of the Master's alliance armies which were waiting for them a few miles away from Manteres, at a river known as the Sea of Sighs. This river wasn't the only way around, as they could just go around the army through the lands of the long summer. But that would be long and gruesome, since the land had become scorched, drowned, and blighted after the doom of Valyria. Maximus wanted to avoid having to go through those lands as much as possible. Landing on the ground, Nyxera lowered her head, allowing Maximus to safely dismount. Your Excellency, one of the Legion commanders began. General Alexander is already in a meeting to determine the plan of action they would take against the Master's army, reported the commander as Lilith and Merlin had joined his side. Excellent, Maximus nodded. His eyes swept across the battlefield, one hand resting on the hilt of his sword. High up from his vantage point, he could see the Master's army, a swarm of insects in the distance by the river, and his own men, seasoned warriors mixed with powerful soldiers summoned from his system who were eager to prove their might. Take me to the general, he commanded as the commander began to lead them to where Alexander was located, which was near the center of the Legion. Lilith and Merlin followed, silently joined by the Imperial guards. Along the way, Lilith and Merlin, who had become quite acquainted with each other over the past month, had begun their own conversation, which lasted the entire walk. Maximus chatted with his Imperial guards like he would normally do to build a strong relationship with them, as they were the ones who risked their life to protect him. The command tent was abuzz with activity as Maximus entered, flanked by Lilith, Merlin, and his Imperial guards. Inside, a large table filled with maps of the region, markers indicating enemy movements, enemy positions, and strategic points along the Sea of Sighs. High General Alexander, who was wearing his light armor bearing his house sigil on the chest plate, bowed respectfully upon seeing Maximus. The other lieutenants, commanders, deputy commanders, elven captains, and dwarven tacticians had followed suit. Maximus waved them off as Alexander started to update him on what was going on. "Your Excellency," Alexander greeted, "the enemy has fortified their position near the river. Their numbers are significant, but their morale appears fractured, likely due to news of our victories in Volantis and our own massive legion." Maximus approached the table, his eyes scanning the map. "What do we know of their composition?" Alexander gestured to one of his lieutenants, a dwarf with a thick beard braided into intricate patterns. "Their army comprises mostly conscripted slaves, with a core of trained soldiers from the Master's Alliance. They have a few war elephants and cavalry, but their primary strength lies in their defensive fortifications along the riverbank." Maximus nodded, his mind already piecing together a plan. "And their weaknesses? Their slaves will break if pressed hard enough, and their leaders are arrogant, expecting us to fight on their terms. The river is their lifeline. If we cut them off from it, their supplies and morale will crumble," replied the dwarf. Lilith stepped forward, her voice laced with curiosity. "What about magic? Have they employed any sorcerers?" "We've received reports of warlocks from the house of Undying within their army, but nothing definitive. If anything, I believe Lady Merlin or Lady Lilith and her witches can handle anything that appear amidst the battle." Merlin and Lilith nodded, as they didn't pick up any powerful magic presences from within the enemy army, but they knew that the enemy could also be masking their own presence to surprise them during the battle. Not worried about the reports of the warlocks, Maximus leaned on the table. "We have the numbers, the strategy, the morale, and the Imperial Air Force. But let's not underestimate them. Their desperation will make the dangerous and cause more casualties than necessary," stated Maximus as he continued. "Here's the plan. We will launch an air attack, drawing the frontline troops away from the edge of the river and their fortifications, allowing our soldiers to cross unchallenged. At the same time, I want the witches flying on top of griffins to target their supply lines and their commanders." He pointed to a section of the map. "The cannons will fire 3 volleys before the air attack, then shift to raining down destruction on their rear lines." Alexander nodded, agreeing with the plan. "A sound plan, Your Excellency. The combination of air superiority, artillery, and coordinated ground forces should ensure minimal losses on our side. The cannons are already in place and ready to fire on your command." "Good. Timing will be critical. The cannons must break their initial lines before our air forces strike, and the distraction must be sufficient to disorient their command structure. Once the griffins and witches have sown chaos, the Eternal Legion will move in and crush their formation." Everybody nodded, and the meeting had ended. They immediately got to work on setting up the things discussed during the meeting. After a few hours had passed, everything was ready. Flying to the forefront of the Legion on top of Nixera, Maximus raised his sword high, his voice booming over the entire battlefield as even the enemy army watched. "Eternal Legion, today we do not just fight an enemy. We begin to destroy an institution of cruelty and oppression. Let the masters know that their time is over, and let the world see the might of our empire." The soldiers roared in unison, their voices echoing across the battlefield. The witches cast their spell as protective magic settled over the army. Above, the griffin riders circled, awaiting their signal. Maximus signaled to the artillery crews. "Fire!" The ground shook as the cannons unleashed their first volley. Explosions erupted across the enemy's front lines, shattering fortifications and sending enemy soldiers into chaos. 2 more volleys followed in rapid succession, devastating the enemy ranks and leaving their defenses in disarray. "Now!" Maximus commanded, and the griffins followed by the black wings dove from the skies, their riders launching volleys of explosive projectiles. Lilith and her witches unleashed a storm of fire and shadow on the enemy supply lines, cutting off reinforcements and further demoralizing the Master's forces. Nixera roared, her massive wings creating gusts that knocked enemy soldiers off balance as Maximus led the charge. The Eternal Legion surged forward, crossing the river unopposed and slamming into the disorganized enemy ranks. The ground forces advanced swiftly, flanking the remaining enemy formations and cutting them down with ruthless efficiency. Hours later, the battlefield lay silent, save for the groans of the wounded and the crackle of dying fires. The Master's army was shattered, their war elephants slain, their cavalry routed, and their commanders either dead or captured. Slaves who had been forced to fight knelt in surrender, their chains broken by the advancing Imperial soldiers. Maximus stood at the center of the battlefield, his armor stained with the blood of his enemies. Nyxera stood behind him, her presence casting a shadow over the broken remains of the enemy army. Alexander approached, saluting. "Victory is ours, Your Excellency. The Master's forces are in full retreat, and their supply lines are in ruins. The Sea of Sighs is ours." Maximus nodded, his expression stoic. "Well done, General. But this is only the beginning. Manteres and the rest of the Master's alliance must fall, and with them, the institution of slavery. Prepare the Legion to march. We will give the people of Slavers Bay a future to look forward to." As the soldiers cheered and the Imperial banners were raised over the battlefield, Maximus turned his gaze to the east, toward the heart of the Master's territory. This victory would be the first step in reshaping the region. A few hours later, the Eternal Legion had arrived in front of Manteres, which had already closed the gates to the city in preparation for the battle. Garrisoning the city was no more than 5,000 slave soldiers, mixed with some of the Master's elite soldiers, to keep the slaves in line. On top of the wall, looking down on the Eternal Legion, Commander Tycherio, the one in command of the entire garrison force, wasn't shocked at all seeing the enemy army already surrounding the city. He heard the stories from the passing merchants about how advanced the Imperials were and how powerful their military was. Then you add the stories about how they possessed dragons and other flying creatures, and one had to think to themselves, how can we win against that? As he looked over the massive Imperial Legion, he gestured for another soldier to approach. "Go inform the Masters that the Imperial army is here," he ordered. The soldier quickly descended from the walls, disappearing into the crowded city. Turning his gaze back to the Imperial forces, Tycherio took a deep breath, preparing himself for what lay ahead. He had no illusions about their situation. They were certainly outmatched and outnumbered. If he wasn't a commander, then he would have certainly fled in this situation. He wasn't born in any of the cities of Slavers Bay. Instead, he was born in the far east, in Carve. Now how did he end up in Slavers Bay? Well, he had crossed the wrong person back in Carve. As a young and ambitious man, he made alliances with powerful women from Zaro Zoandaxos' household to Koja and Mo, the head of one of Carth's powerful merchant families. From these alliances, Tycherio had gained incredible influence and power. Too much, perhaps, for his own good. Eventually, Tycherio's ambition had led him to attempt a plot against one of the 13, the ruling class in Carth. The plan was uncovered, however, and Tycherio was seized and sold as a slave to a master in Slavers Bay. His gift for strategy and his ruthlessness caught the eye of his master, who used him to command his personal guard until a few months ago, when he was appointed as a commander due to the current war that was going on. That's how he ended up in his current situation. Leaving the past behind, he took one last look at the Imperial forces before he himself got down from the wall. The city was buzzing with activity as slaves and soldiers hurried to prepare for an onslaught they knew they couldn't win. Tycherio had begun issuing orders to prepare for an unwinnable battle. As he was doing this, he saw a massive shadow pass by him, causing him to look up and see the cause of the shadow. Flying above the city as a form of fear tactic was Nyxera, who caused some soldiers to start panicking seeing such a massive creature flying over the city. Of course, everybody heard that the Imperials had dragons. No one truly believed it until they saw it with their own eyes. And now that they have, fighting against something that can just bypass their defenses was useless. Outside the walls, Maximus stood at the front of his legion as they were lined up in front of the city, ready to take it over. But they had just won a victory a few hours ago and had to march another 12 hours to reach the city. As much as he knew they were eager to fight, He also knew the advantages of having a well-rested army. But if his plan was successful, then they might not need to fight any battle. Set up camp. He ordered as the legion began to unload their supplies from the carts and set up their camp. Appearing next to him was a shadow hand agent who was tasked with infiltrating the city, killing the masters, and throwing the defenders into chaos. Your Excellency, we have successfully infiltrated the Master's manor and will wait until morning to kill them. Maximus nodded, gazing back at the city walls. Very well, he replied. We will wait until dawn before launching the attack. The Masters will likely expect us to act immediately, and we will use this to our advantage. A few hours later, it was well past midnight, and the slave soldiers had kept a tight watch on any movement outside of the wall. The Masters didn't believe that the Imperials would wait until morning to attack, so they forced the soldiers to stay on guard for the entire night, depriving them of the much-needed sleep that they would need for the morning battle. Tycherio tried to tell them that they should have soldiers man the walls on shifts to ensure that everybody got enough sleep, but the Masters ignored his suggestion and simply said that if the soldiers want to eat, then they can stay awake protecting the city for as many hours as they need them to. Tycherio was used to this type of response from powerful people who didn't know the limits of a person or the effects of the conditions that are thrust upon them. And there were too many of the Master's spies within the army for him to take matters into his own hands, so all he could do was obey them. As dawn broke, shadowy figures were sneaking around the Master's manor as they enjoyed their breakfast with their families. One Master was in the middle of talking with his wife as their very throats were slit. This scene occurred at each of the Master's manors until all of them were dead. Within his tent, one of the shadow hand agents appeared in front of Maximus kneeling. Your Excellency, the mission is complete. All the Masters within the city are dead. Excellent, replied Maximus, standing up from his chair and proceeding outside of his tent. Everybody was already lined up and ready to take the city, with the defenders already in position, ready to repel the Imperials despite their fatigue. Tycherio was already on top of the wall, preparing for a battle that he knew they couldn't win. Once Maximus ordered the attack to begin, the cannons were the first things fired, striking the walls of the city. The Imperial Air Force flew above, taking care of the soldiers on top of the walls while the elf spearmen moved forward, protected by a barrier which deflected the enemy's arrows. Tycherio was actively shouting orders amidst the battle when he heard the news. One of his lieutenants, face ashen and voice trembling, reported the slaughter of the Masters. The realization hit him like a punch in the gut, and he nearly fell to his knees due to a nearby explosion that rocked the wall. The Masters were dead, and the chaos that would follow once the slave soldiers found out would be anarchy. So, he decided, raise the white flag. He ordered, his voice loud and clear. His lieutenant hesitated, his face frozen as he looked at his commander. Raise it, Tycherio yelled again. The lieutenant nodded grimly, grabbing a nearby white cloth, hastily tied it onto a spear and raised it high above the city walls. They were surrendering. With the Masters dead, they no longer had control over the slave soldiers, and they couldn't stop him from doing the right thing. As soon as the white flag was raised, the Imperial cannons ceased fire while Nyxra and the Imperial Air Force hovered over the city as a reminder of their capabilities. Maximus watched as the white flag waved atop the city walls. A victorious smile appeared on his face as he turned to his legion, raising his hand, signaling them to hold their positions. He watched as the city gates slowly opened, allowing him access into the city. Inside the city, Tycherio descended from the wall and walked towards the open gates. His soldiers parts before him, their eyes wide with fear and uncertainty at this decision taken by their commander. As he neared the gate, he saw a group of people approaching wearing full-plate dark armor. These were the Black Guard of Nagorond, who sent chills down Tycherio's back. I have been sent in place of His Excellency to discuss terms, said the lead figure. Though his voice was muffled by the metal helm that obscured his face, there was an inherent authority to it. The man was tall and imposing, his armor adorned with intricate symbols of power and prestige. My name is Raylar Blackthorn. Tycherio swallowed hard. It was an effort to keep his voice steady as he replied. I am Tycherio, commander of the city's army. We surrender. Rayler nodded as he knew that they stood no chance if they continued to resist, and with the masters dead, there was nothing forcing them to fight. Very well, then. His Excellency will offer mercy to every soldier and civilian within the city, except for slavers. Anybody considered a slave will be put to death no matter their excuse, and all slaves will become free henceforth. Do we have terms? While it sounded like a question, Tycherio knew that it was more of an order, and he was in no way going to refuse this offer for him and the other slave soldiers to live another day. Yes, we have terms. Though as he said this, some lieutenants who were not slaves and loyal to the masters had walked out of the gates behind Tycherio, screaming and shouting. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" shouted the first one. "Negotiating our surrender," Tycherio replied, loud enough for all present to hear. "You're betraying the masters," screamed another lieutenant, his voice filled with disbelief and indignity. "The masters are already dead," Tycherio stated coldly, shooting the man a hard glare. "Or have you not heard? As of now, I am in command. Anyone who opposes it can step forward now." "We don't take orders from a mere slave," one lieutenant exclaimed, his voice desperate. "We are the freemen, and you are the slave, so you will follow our orders." Rayler chuckled under his helm. "Well then, lads," he said sarcastically, "looks like you've got three choices. Join your dead masters, become the slaves you scorned, or accept this deal. Remember," he pointed at the Imperial troop formation behind him, "we have cannons ready to fire any time." Seeing the massive army behind Rayler, the protesting lieutenants' faces paled at the sight of the Imperial army. Their gazes looked over the massive formation of soldiers, then up in the sky at the strange flying creatures which started to get rowdy because they couldn't feast on their prey below. There was nothing they could do but to surrender. They weren't masters anyway, so they could still live on, but who knows what their future held. With that out of the way, the Eternal Legion marched into the city and started to secure all the former masters' possessions, arrest the remaining soldiers, and start integrating the city under Imperial rule. Maximus had his army rest for a few days before they set off to attack Tolos. Alexander would lead the army to take Tolos, while Maximus would head to the Imperial fleet to help them in attacking Illyria, which was situated on an island off the coast of Tolos. On top of Nyxera, Maximus was flying over the city of Illyria alongside Merlin, who was flying on top of her Blackwing, which she named Shadowflame. She was at first given a griffin, but she preferred the wild nature of the black wings, so she was given one which she managed to tame with her magic. Below, the city of Illyria was surrounded on all sides by the Imperial fleet, cut off from the outside world and from receiving any supplies that it needed to survive a long siege. The defenders of the city, which numbered 10,000, hadn't heard about what happened to Manteres, yet which was advantageous to Maximus's plans. Illyria, which is known for its impressive naval power because it was located on an island, was now but a former shell of itself. Their fleet was destroyed alongside the rest of the Masters' Alliance fleet during their third campaign against the Imperial fleet. Now Illyria was defenseless from the sea and could only rely on the walls of their city. Within the city, the same thing that happened in Manteres was going to happen in Illyria and Tolos as well. Flying over Admiral Thorne's flagship, the Imperial Fury, Maximus jumped off of Nyxera and landed on the deck of the ship. He removed his helm as Merlin followed suit, landing Shadowflame on the deck of the ship because he was much smaller than Nyxera, who was 40 meters in length and had a wingspan of 48 meters. She would crush the flagship if she attempted to land on it. Admiral Thorne had got on one knee and put her right hand across her chest, which was a standard salute for captains and other officers of the Imperial Navy. The rest of the crew had snapped to attention, their arms at their sides, and eyes staring straight forward, not directly looking at anything. "At ease," Maximus said as he walked up to Admiral Thorne. "Your Excellency, we're ready for your orders." Maximus nodded slowly, observing the way the rest of the crew relaxed slightly, but still held themselves with rigid discipline. "Excellent," he replied. "The Shadow End agents are already infiltrating the city and killing the Masters, Once we get word that the masters are dead, then we can move in and force a surrender from the defending forces." "Understood, Your Excellency," Thorne replied. "I've instructed the fleet to maintain their current positions. We'll tighten the blockade and wait for your signal." Admiral Thorne began to order her ships to tighten their formation around the city, while the troop ships, which transport land troops for battle, got into position. While the fleet was preparing for combat, Maximus decided to take a moment and appreciate the scene before him. The sight of the Imperial fleet around Illyria's island was just a prelude to what the future held. Interrupting his admiration, a shadow hand agent appeared next to him. "Your Excellency, the Illyrian masters are dead. However, the commander of the defending forces have already surrendered after murdering all the master's officers within the army. Seems like they have come to their senses," he murmured. "Quite," Merlin stated. Seeing the white flag wave from the walls of the city, Maximus ordered the troops to take control of the city, arresting the defenders until the conflict was over. The arrested defenders were treated as imperial prisoners of war and thrown into prison camps, which made sure they received all of their basic needs and such. Then, just like Manteries, the Imperial army moved in and started to enforce Imperial law and rules, and completely get rid of slavery, while also implementing the recovery system for former slaves. At Tolos, Alexander, who was leading the Eternal Legion to take the city, had just finished conquering the city, which also surrendered after the masters were assassinated. Now the western part of Slavers Bay was completely under Imperial control, leaving only the major cities of Meereen, Yunkai, and Astapor standing. Unlike Illyria, Manteries, and Tolos, the major slave trading cities of Slavers Bay had hired dozens of warlocks to protect them, making assassination impossible for the Shadow Hand agents. This is where the true major battle of this conflict would take place. So, for this, Maximus, together with his subordinates, had created a three-pronged attack plan involving land, air, and sea. From land, the Eternal Legion would siege the walls of the cities, while from the sea, the Imperial Navy would bombard their ports and land troops. From the air, the Black Wings, Griffins, and Nyxera would raid death down on the defenders. The battle for Meereen, Yunkai, and Astapor would be the final battles of the conflict. The strategy they had devised was bold, ambitious, and ruthless. These cities were not only the heart of Slavers Bay, but also fortified bastions with an unyielding resolve to resist the Imperial advance. It was no longer just about defeating armies. It was about breaking the spirit of the enemy, and the Imperials were prepared to do so. Siege of Meereen. The Eternal Legion, in a wave of unrelenting force, began their advance toward Meereen. The city, with its imposing walls and proud history of resistance, had never faced an opponent quite like the Imperial army. As the Legion marched, the sound of drums and the rumble of cannons filled the air. On the horizon, the Imperial fleet, the greatest the world had ever seen, encircled the port. Maximus stood among his officers at the front, overlooking the massive formation. Nyxera circled above, her wings creating gusts of wind that whipped through the soldiers below. The Black Wings and Griffins, led by Merlin, flew overhead, their presence alone striking fear into the hearts of the defenders. The shadows of their wings cast long, ominous shapes over the fields leading to the city. The first wave of cannon fire struck the city walls, causing massive explosions that echoed through the streets of Meereen. The defenders, who had been preparing for a prolonged siege, were caught off guard by the intensity of the assault. The cannons hammered away at their fortifications, creating gaping holes in the once impenetrable walls. The Imperial air forces swooped in, unleashing fire and terror from above, while Nyxera, with her imposing size and fiery breath, scorched the battlements, sending defenders fleeing in all directions. From the ground, the Eternal Legion's infantry began their charge. Elf spearmen formed ranks, using their shields to block incoming arrows and missiles, while the heavy dwarven infantry pressed forward, the massive siege weapons giving them an advantage against the crumbling walls. The defenders of Meereen, once confident in the warlock's power, were now realizing that their magic could not hold against such overwhelming force. Meereen had long prided itself on its ability to resist invaders, but this battle was different. The warlocks, though still holding some ground, were retreating into the heart of the city, where they could no longer project their power effectively. It was only a matter of time before the gates would fall. As the final blow to the gates came, the city's defenders realized their position was untenable. Alexander's voice echoed across the command center as he ordered the final charge into the city. The Imperial witches targeted the enemy warlocks, while any remaining defenders who tried to fight were killed. Those that surrendered were shown mercy, and any warlocks captured would be brought back to Heaven's Reach and interrogated. The masters of Meereen were dragged out of their palaces and publicly executed for all to see. Yunkai's last stand. 5 days later, while Meereen fell, the remaining cities of Yunkai and Astapor were preparing for their own battles. The leaders of Yunkai, having seen the fall of their neighboring city, were unwilling to submit without a fight. Their warlocks, wielding dark and twisted magics, began casting powerful wards and protections, attempting to shield the city from the incoming onslaught. Merlin had cast her own magic, which quickly dismantled the shield around the city, allowing the Imperial forces to attack it. The warlocks were shocked, as never before had they encountered something like this. Their magic was dismantled in an instant, as if it was nothing. The aerial forces descended upon the city, just like Meereen, with Nyxra's fiery breath incinerating the walls, turning them into molten rock that poured into the streets below, causing chaos and disarray among the city's defenders. As this unfolded, the Imperial Navy moved closer to Yunkai's coast. Once in range, their cannons fired volley after volley into the city, shaking its foundation and weakening any defensive structures still standing. All defenses were assaulted simultaneously from every direction, leaving no opportunity for reorganization. From within Yunkai, desperate cries and pleas for mercy were shouted, but they went unheard as the sound of steel against steel and magic was louder. The inhabitants witnessed a fierce display of power that either sparked terror or awe, sometimes both, as Imperial soldiers swept through every alley and street. The warlocks of Yunkai, sensing defeat, attempted a last-ditch effort to cast an all-encompassing curse. But as they focused their energy, Nyxra dove from the skies, her fiery breath searing the warlocks from the air, while the Legion's forces took control of every part of the city. Their magic was powerful, but they were no match. And just as it started, within hours, the battle was over, and the masters were executed. Astapor, the final battle. Astapor, the last of the major cities of Slaver's Bay, had already begun preparing for the inevitable. The city's warlocks had gathered in the citadel, creating powerful magical defenses around the city. They would not give up easily. Maximus, standing alongside his commanders, surveyed the city one last time. The battle would be similar to Yunkai's battle. The warlocks would fight with everything they had, and they would likely use every dark magic at their disposal. But the Imperial witches and other magic forces would show these warlocks that the House of the Undying isn't as powerful as it thinks it is. "We end this here," Maximus declared. "The warlocks will be dealt with first, followed by the fall of the city. When Astapor falls, Slaver's Bay will be no more." And with that, the final battle began. The Imperial forces, after days of preparation, launched their assault. The cannons fired relentlessly, creating cracks in Astapor's towering walls. The warlocks gathered at the citadel, preparing to unleash their most powerful spells. But once again, the Black Wings carrying witches on their backs disrupted their focus, while Nyxra tore through the defenses. On the ground, the Legion advanced. The final stand of the Masters was a desperate one. But no matter how many spells they cast, no matter how many walls they built, the might of the Eternal Legion proved to be unstoppable. Astapor's walls crumbled. The warlocks, having spent their last strength to protect their city, fell one by one to the witches. In the end, Slaver's Bay was freed from its chains. With the fall of the last city, the Eternal Legion stood victorious. The once powerful cities of Meereen, Yunkai, and Astapor were now under Imperial rule, their slave markets erased from the face of the earth. The former slaves now stood as free people ready to rebuild and be reintroduced into society as free people. Maximus stood at the heart of the shattered city of Astapor, looking out over the ruins. His army, victorious and battle-worn, assembled behind him. This was the dawn of a new era, one where the shackles of slavery were broken, and the people of Slavers' Bay would finally be free. Sitting within the former seat of power for the masters of Yunkai, Maximus was surrounded by his loyal subordinates, Alexander, Admiral Thorne, Lilith, and Merlin. Your Excellency, with Slavers' Bay in our hands, we have now crippled the slave trade which has plagued Essos for centuries and can now usher in a new era of imperial rule where the idea of slavery exists no longer. Merlin stated, her eyes shining with a renowned hope for what the future held. It is a new dawn where the weak are no longer prey to the powerful, where every individual, no matter what their race or status may be, can live free. Indeed, replied Maximus, but our work here is far from done. We've done well to shatter the chains of physical slavery, but it'll take time to erase the marks they leave on the minds and hearts of men. Unrolling a map of Essos, Maximus leaned forward, pointing towards Lys, Myr, and Tyrosh. These are our next targets, he announced. If we want to uproot slavery entirely from this continent, these cities need to fall. The room fell quiet as the enormity of their mission sank in. To change the very foundations of a culture was no small task, yet their resolve remained strong as they were going to complete this mission no matter the costs. Your Excellency, if we're to take control of these cities, I think that we should build more ships and bolster our navy, Admiral Thorne stated. Those 3 cities had a relatively good navy because of the constant conflicts with each other. Maximus nodded. You're right, Admiral. Begin drafting plans for expanding the fleet and send it to me so I can review it and personally approve it. Turning to Alexander, Maximus continued, I want you to set up a garrison of 5,000 soldiers in each city, then take the remaining soldier to Volantis to start preparing to take Lys, Myr, and Tyrosh. You can command the legion yourself or put somebody else in charge. Alexander nodded, understanding his task. Merlin and Lilith, we will return to Heaven's Reach, as I'm sure I have tons of work piled up in my office. Merlin and Lilith both agreed with this action since it was not required for Maximus to lead the legion from the front anymore. They had taken out the major slave-trading cities to free hundreds of thousands of people from the clutches of slavery, while also sending a strong message to the rest of the world on the Imperial Union's stance on slavery. While it was Imperial law already that slavery is banned, and any slave brought into Imperial territory will be free, not many of the free cities expected this to affect the lands outside of the Imperial Union's territory. But now with the fall of Slavers' Bay, this original expectation was proven wrong. Once the meeting ended, Maximus walked to where Nyxera was and climbed on her back, taking flight towards the Imperial capital. Lilith and Merlin followed behind with the entire Imperial Air Force, which was no longer needed in the region. During the flight, he accepted his rewards for capturing Slavers' Bay. Conquer Slavers' Bay, fulfilling your anti-slavery policy and bringing about a new era completed. Greek hero Achilles comes with his 2,500 Myrmidons and their commanders. Giants, 23 foot tall, huge humanoids that have a long lifespan. -1K Dragon Knights. Dragon Knights are unique soldiers bearing the symbol of a dragon on their armor, which was also extremely strong compared to regular armor. Because of how powerful they are, their armor can be replicated. Imperial Banner. The Imperial Banner, when carried into battle by a legion, every soldier will receive improved morale, battle instincts, increased strength, and reduce how fatal wounds are. New Empire-wide ability. Resistance to corruption or mind manipulation. This new empire-wide ability will become a natural ability for all Imperial citizens who have been conquered, born, or now live in any Imperial-owned lands. Hostile gods and other magical forces will have a hard time corrupting the minds of those with this ability. -280K system points. After receiving his rewards, he also received a new world development from the system. With the conquering of Slaver's Bay, the god Roller has taken a keen interest into what's happening in the world, as well as other higher beings. The destruction of the Red Temple in Volantis, in addition to the conquering of Slaver's Bay, has made Roller move to intervene in Essos and place his religion as the dominant religion. In Valyria, he took over the Old City and began building his army to conquer Essos and the rest of the known world. 10 years from now, his armies will descend from Valyria and start its advance. In order to hope to stand a chance against the power of a good, you must first ascend to the level of demigod by completing the following trials. Conquer the flames of eternity, a volcanic dungeon where the air burns and lava flow freely. Survive the ocean of despair, a boundless sea where storms rage and ancient sea monsters hunt. Navigate the sky's pinnacle, a floating island with ever-changing winds and lightning storms. Endure the Earth's gauntlet, a subterranean maze filled with crushing tunnels, rock guardians, and earthquakes. You must venture these paths alone and overcome massive threats. Seeing this, Maximus had become worried for the first time since he came into this world. Sure, he could conquer a city with ease now, but beating a god was not something that he ever imagined himself doing, nor was ascending to a demigod level. But if he must do these things in order to protect his empire and his own life, then he had no choice in the matter. Alexander began to carry out his mission, setting up 5,000-man garrisons in each city and appointing a suitable officer as commandants. In this sense, a commandant was something that Alexander created for an imperial officer in charge of a city's garrison. Normally, the guards of a city would be from the local population, but considering they just took over the region, it would take time to train local city guards as the protectors of the city. Admiral Thorne had left a small fleet of 20 ships to patrol the Gulf of Grief and deal with any pirates, while she herself took the rest of the fleet and returned to Volantis, where she would travel through the Rhoyne River to New Rhoyne, where her fleet's headquarters was located. While not the ideal location because they were restricted by a single river, it was their only option at the time she was appointed. She plans to have it moved to Volantis soon to have better access to the sea, but it would take time to rebuild all the naval facilities from New Rohine and Volantis. As news of the Masters' Alliance collapse spread over the next few months, the free cities of Bravos and Pintos both sent a representative to Heaven's Reach to try and improve their relationship with the rising power that is the Imperial Union. In the courtyard of the Imperial Palace, Maximus stood there covered in sweat as he was having a mock battle with Merlin to see how far he had gotten with his magic. If he wanted to complete his trials, then he needed to have multiple abilities and skills that he could use. As of now, he had reached only 12% magic proficiency in a span of a few months, which was slow progress in his opinion. Despite training almost hours every day, progress was slow, which he figured may be the result of having no prior knowledge on the concepts of magic. After all, the most powerful magic user he knows have spent decades learning their magic. But he didn't have decades. He had 8 years at most to reach 100% proficiency and complete his trials, leaving him with 2 years to prepare for the invasion. Arriving back at Heaven's Reach after months of being away due to the war, Maximus was relieved to finally return to the comfort of his palace. It was also a sight to see the difference between Heaven's Reach and the other cities of Essos. Sure, each city had its own uniqueness and beauty, but none of that compared to Heaven's Reach, which was already heavily favored by merchants from around dozens of places. Merchants coming from across the Bone Mountain, merchants from the Seven Kingdoms, and merchants from the other free cities could be seen coming and going to the city. Most of the trade routes were through land, but a recent one had just opened up through Volantis, which would allow merchant ships to travel along the Rhoyne River and to the port of Heaven's Reach. This would open up a new trade route for sea merchants and reinvest into the economy of Volantis, as selling slaves was no longer an option. Right now, one of the Imperial Union's main exports was food and alcohol, which brought in the most profits, while other high-quality things like perfumes, glassware, and jewelry were among the other things exported. Thanks to the modern agricultural tools and methods combined with magic, Heaven's Reach was able to produce massive amounts of food from the surrounding farmlands that were established. Farmers were mostly former slaves, as Dothraki were not too keen on working the land. So those former slaves who are now free and an imperial citizen were mainly hired as farmers. Medicinal herbs and potions were also a very popular export, as the nobles of Westeros and other wealthy people enjoyed the benefits the potions brought to their life. Landing within a clearing inside of the palace walls, which was specifically cleared for Nyxera's massive size, Maximus was greeted by Ianwe and Olerin. "Your Excellency, it's great to see you again," expressed Olerin as he bowed his head slightly. Ianwe, standing beside him, offered a warm smile. "Welcome back, Your Excellency. We trust your journey was fruitful." Nyxera laid her head on the ground while Maximus extended a rope to climb down safely. Despite her head laying on the ground, she was still massive, requiring Maximus to climb onto and off of her back via rope. Once he hit the ground, he rubbed his hand on her neck, feeling the connection the two of them shared. Nyxera continued to lay down, feeling the soft touch of her lord, her eyes half open as she enjoyed the attention. As Maximus stopped, she kept lying on the ground while the Imperial dragon tamers came to take care of her. She trusted them only because Maximus trusted them, so she obeyed what they said to an extent that it was reasonable. "It's good to be back," Maximus replied as he handed his sword over to one of the palace maids who was in charge of taking care of his weapons. Next, his armor was removed, leaving only the clothes he wore underneath, which was a simple, finely tailored tunic adorned with the sigil of his house. He stretched, feeling a rush of relief as the weight of the armor was removed from his body. He didn't wear full-plate armor, but pieces of armor that could be easily attached and removed from his body. "What's changed since I left?" Maximus asked as he started walking into the palace. Ianwe and Olerin followed him alongside the palace Imperial guards. "Well, since you left, the dwarves have finished creating the magic train about 2 months ago alongside the tracks that would provide the path for the train to follow. As of now, the magic train has attracted positive attention from the public, and the people continue to praise you for this godly creation, but I made sure that the dwarves got the popularity they deserve and the credit on your behalf." Olerin explained as detailed as possible. "Good," Maximus replied. "Credit should always go to those who actually invented it rather than those who were just on the sidelines." While it was true he funded the dwarves, the idea of magic trains might not have been possible this fast without them. Tracks have already been laid out throughout the city, to V's Dothrak, New Royne, and various other places. We are still constructing the tracks from New Royne to Volantis, and eventually the new cities which have been brought under Imperial control. Maximus nodded in satisfaction at this news, since it would allow for faster transportation between cities. Ianwe chimed in next. "The population of the city has reached 2 million registered residents in addition to thousands of unregistered people moving here from various other places. I already put out an incentive of military service being the quickest way to earn citizenship for those born in places outside of our controlled land." Ianwe reported. 2 million, Maximus said out loud, as that number was surprising for a city during this time and in this world. Such a staggering number of people meant that Heaven's Reach had effectively become the heart not only of his empire, but of Essos itself. For some empires or kingdoms, it might sound like a logistical nightmare to manage such a large population, but thanks to careful planning and continued expansion of the city and development of the surrounding lands, the city did not suffer from any food problems, but there was another problem. With this massive number, unemployment has also risen, with many jobs being filled swiftly due to the efficiency of the automated systems and magical constructs we've introduced. Ianwe continued. While the citizens are well-fed and sheltered thanks to the Imperial welfare system, there is unrest brewing among some of those who are unable to find meaningful work. "Idle hands, as they say. Idle hands indeed," he murmured, thinking aloud. "This could become if left unchecked." Olerin stepped in, his staff slightly tapping against the marble floor. "It would be wise to create additional avenues for employment, Your Excellency. Perhaps expanding infrastructure projects or fostering new industries. It could also be an opportunity to integrate more cultural events or festivals, something to keep the people united while providing jobs." "I agree. Let's also create more large-scale projects to keep transforming the city. Additionally, set up an exploration guild to hire people to explore the land to the far east alongside any land in Essos that we have not discovered. We still have the Basilisk Isles to the south of Slaver's Bay and the islands of Ibn to our north, ordered Maximus. He had been putting off the exploration of these places for some time. We nodded thoughtfully. A wise strategy, Your Excellency. This will create hundreds, possibly thousands of more jobs and increase our exploration capabilities. Make it so, he commanded as they climbed the spiral staircase leading to the central council chamber. This is when Allerin remembered another topic. Also, Your Excellency, those lords from the Seven Kingdoms sent represent their king have been wanting to see you for months now and are getting more eager by the day. Though I know for a fact, it's just to see what type of person you are and see what they could try and leverage from you. Maximus thought for a moment as he sat down. He was at the top of the hierarchy when it came to the Imperial Union, and the power of the Seven Kingdoms was not too weak to challenge him. Allowing them to even think that they can try and find a weakness within him would be a dangerous precedent to set. It seems the wolves of Westeros are sniffing at our doors, hoping to find a crack in the walls, he said aloud. Do we know which lords they've sent, Allerin? Yes, Your Excellency. Representatives include Lord Mace Tyrell from Highgarden and Ser Davos Seaworth, seeking to strengthen economic ties and study our strengths and weaknesses. And what have they stated their purpose is? Maximus asked. While their official reason is diplomacy, we interjected, his arms folded behind his back. It's clear they aim to understand the Empire from within. They wish to gauge our defenses, resources, and political structure, likely with hopes of either future alliances or potential leverage against us. Maximus leaned back in his chair as he thought about this for a moment. He wanted to keep them guessing, never getting a face-to-face meeting with him, but allowing them to speak to his subordinates as they were officially here representing the Seven Kingdoms. In the end, he decided to do just that. He believed that both Allerin and Eowyn knew what they were doing, and he trusted them to handle this matter as they saw fit, ensuring the Empire would gain benefits from dealing with the Seven Kingdoms. 1 year later, 289 AC. Since returning to Heaven's Reach, Maximus has been focused on dealing with the more day-to-day operation of his empire, which mostly consisted of signing papers. He was the highest authority in the Imperial Union, but most things were delegated to certain individuals, such as Allerin and Eowyn, who were granted the authority to act on his behalf. Alongside this, every day in the courtyard of his palace, he would spend several hours practicing magic with both Merlin and Lilith, or some days Allerin and Eowyn. By learning from 4 different teachers, he could learn a great deal from each of them, including their distinct styles, philosophies, and techniques, so that he can have a cohesive and formidable mastery of magic. Merlin emphasized the ancient elemental forces of the world, teaching him to mold fire, earth, wind, and water as easily as one might shape clay. Lilith took a more cerebral approach, focusing on the nuances of magical theory and manipulation of the arcane weave itself. She claimed that true power lay in understanding not just what magic could do, but why it worked. Allerin's guidance was rooted in wisdom and restraint. His lessons often felt like philosophical debates more than spellcasting practice. Yet Maximus found his mind sharper for it. And then there was Eowyn, whose martial discipline combined magic with physical prowess, a combination of swordplay and spell work that turned battle into an art form. The courtyard was filled with sounds of magic spell eruptions as Maximus pushed himself to his limits under their watchful eyes. His mind was absorbing the knowledge almost instantly. Though he was already powerful by virtue of the abilities granted to him by the system and by being an otherworlder, he knew that raw talent alone would not ensure his continued survival in this world, especially during the trials that he would need to take in order to transform into a demigod. Again, barked Eowyn during an afternoon session in which Maximus struggled to maintain his footing. The clash of energy between his sword and Eowyn's enchanted blade sent sparks flying around them like a meteor shower. Maximus grinned through the exhaustion, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You enjoy this too much," he said, raising his blade in preparation for another attack. His muscles ached, but he had learned that Eowyn's relentless approach was what forced him to improve. Ianwe's stern expression changed into a faint smile. Perhaps, but your enemies will not be kinder than me. Again, Maximus lunged forward, channeling magic into his blade as Ianwe parried. The wind shifted violently around them as Maximus unleashed a burst of wind magic, attempting to knock Ianwe off balance. But Ianwe was ready. He twisted his body and countered with a blow that sent Maximus stumbling back. From the edge of the courtyard, Lilith watched with a raised brow, her arms folded across her chest. "You're relying too much on brute force," she called out, her voice carrying a bit of critique. "Ianwe is testing your precision, not your power." Noted, Maximus muttered under his breath, planting his feet firmly on the ground and taking a deep, steadying breath. He adjusted his grip on the blade, letting Lilith's words sink in. Precision, not power. The next strike needed to be precise. Ianwe raised his blade. Focus. "A single moment of clarity can turn the tide of any battle," he said. Maximus closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, tuning out the world around him. He felt the wave of magic in the air, the energy coursing through his body. When he opened his eyes again, he knew what his next move needed to be. He surged forward, this time with measured steps. Ianwe moved to intercept, but Maximus feinted to the right, twisting his blade at the last second to send a wave of fire toward his opponent. The flames slightly hit Ianwe's armor, forcing him to pivot. Seizing the opening, Maximus followed up with a precise arc of lightning, his blade crackling with energy as it struck. Ianwe deflected the blow, but barely. His expression shifted to one of approval as he stepped back, lowering his weapon. "Better. You're learning to think beyond the immediate attack," he said, nodding. "But remember, precision isn't just about the strike, it's about timing. You'll need both to give you a greater chance in your trials." Maximus straightened, breathing heavily. Noted. Again, before Ianwe could respond, Merlin clapped her hands from across the courtyard. "Enough sparring for today. It will be terrible for the Emperor to end up burnt and half dead," she said jokingly. "Besides, Lilith has been glaring at you like she's about to unleash an hour-long lecture on magical finesse." Lilith smirked, her crimson eyes gleaming as she stepped forward. "Perhaps I will. If you insist on exhausting yourself, the least you could do is make it worthwhile." Maximus groaned, but didn't argue. He knew better than to challenge Lilith when she was in one of her teaching moods. He was the one who ordered them to speak with him freely when they weren't in an official setting, while it took a few months for it eventually become normal to them. "Fine, but don't expect me to stay awake if this turns into another philosophical debate." Everybody chuckled lightly as Maximus sheathed his sword and joined the others at the edge of the courtyard. The trials to ascend to demigodhood loomed closer with each passing day, a shadow on the horizon that he couldn't ignore. Yet, with his powerful subordinates by his side, teaching him how to fully utilize his power. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Maximus went inside to take a bath, followed by Lilith and Merlin, who used their positions as his personal aides to accompany him even in the bath. Maximus wasn't complaining. Well, who would in this situation, having on one side a goth witch and on the other side a dark-haired sorceress? He had no complaints and was actually the more aggressive one, as he often needed to unwind after training for several hours. Lilith and Merlin were glad to step up and be the ones to help him unwind. In the east, Alexander had finished his conquest of Elis, Mir, and Tyrosh, the three cities now under the control of the Imperial Union. Now the Imperial Union controlled almost every free city except for Norvos, Pintos, Bravos, Cohor, and Lorith. Bravos and Pintos had already sent people to improve the relations between the Imperial Union and their city. As a result, trade agreements were signed allowing for an exchange of resources in exchange for an end to slavery. Bravos was already anti-slavery, so something like this was no problem. As for Pintos, it had been recently forced to end the practice of slavery after losing their last war with Bravos. And to get around this, they created a system of indentured servitude to replace chattel slavery, which was different from slavery, as one could earn their freedom. Maximus decided to overlook this since the system in which Pintos had in place benefited even those in indentured servitude, and they were not treated as slaves. Trade flourished between the Imperial Union and the two free cities as they relied heavily on trade with other cities which were now a part of the Imperial Union. As for Qohor, Norvos, and Lorith, the three cities did not want to abide by Maximus's mandate of abolishing slavery. In Norvos, the bearded priests couldn't come to terms with abolishing slavery. They saw it as a prelude to allowing the Imperial Union to just throw its influence around and expect people to obey. They believed it was their religious mandate to resist the imperial influence. For now, Maximus didn't move against Norvos and just ignored the city, for now at least. Qohor and Lorith had surprisingly caved into the pressure and agreed to Maximus's terms. This allowed trade to continue to flourish throughout all of the free cities, except for Norvos, who was cut off from any trading from the Imperial Union. The Silver Serpent Trading Company had closed up their buildings within the city and left, causing even the people to become concerned at what was going on. The bearded priests held the power now, but if they continue to ignore the people's needs, then Maximus will not have to do anything at all. Slaver's Bay has been renamed to the Bay of Horizons, representing new opportunities and a break from the dark past. This name evokes the idea of looking forward to a brighter horizon. In addition to this, Maximus created 6 new noble families from people who have proved their loyalty and dedication to him and the Imperial Union, which inspired many others to strive for such success and be granted a title of nobility. Unlike other places where nobility is usually from people of noble blood, it was different for the Imperial Union. Maximus established a clear merit-based system where people could become a noble through military service, civil service, economic contributions, and scholarly and cultural achievements. This allowed anyone who worked hard enough to be able to achieve a higher status within the Imperial Union. With the promise of nobility tied to accomplishments, people are incentivized to work harder and contribute to the empire's prosperity, fostering a culture of ambition and innovation. Current year, 290 AC. In the courtyard of the palace, Prince Viserys was currently being trained by one of the warmongers of the Imperial Guard. He was at the age of 13 and had been studying at the Academy of Excellence, which is one of 3 academies in Heaven's Reach. The other 2 were the Imperial War Academy and the Academy of Mystical Studies. The Imperial War Academy is where officers go to train and become leaders in the Imperial Union's armed forces, while the Academy of Mystical Studies delves into the magical arts, recruiting only those extremely loyal and who prove to have some type of magic aptitude. To be accepted into any of the academies was considered a privilege and paved the way towards a brighter future for all who attended. The entrance age of each academy generally started at ages 12 to 13 and would take students through 6 years of courses teaching advanced knowledge to those who were deemed worthy of attending. Primary and secondary school lasted till the age of 16, teaching regular citizens basic knowledge of the world, including the kingdoms and their history, and as much basic education as the people of this world could handle. The sun had just set as Prince Viserys swung his wooden sword against his instructor, Ser Alaric. His movements were still clumsy, but determination filled his eyes as he trained to master the technique that he was being taught. "Focus, little lord. Your body moves faster than your mind," Ser Alaric barked, parrying Viserys' attack. He stumbled back a step, then quickly regained his posture, readying himself for another attempt. Each clash of wooden swords echoed throughout the courtyard. On the other side of the courtyard, Queen Riella watched alongside 6-year-old Daenerys, who clutched the small doll given to her by Maximus. Her purple eyes watched in fascination as she absorbed the sight of her brother's training. While she was worried about her brother, she also knew how strong the witches were and knew that if anything happened, her brother would be healed in an instant. "Will I be just as strong as my brother one day, Mother?" she asked, her tiny voice overshadowed by the sounds of the wooden swords clanging against each other. Queen Riella smiled tenderly at Daenerys, brushing a lock of her hair behind her ear. "If you work hard enough, my sweet Dany, you will find your own way to shine." Her heart was filled with both pride and protectiveness towards her children as they were, as far as she knew, the last members of her ancient household. Unlike when she was in King's Landing, here in heaven's reach within the Emperor's palace. She always felt safe and was allowed as much freedom as she wanted without having to worry about her safety. The King's Guard members who fled to continue serving her were given a barracks near where she was staying and allowed to carry swords within palace grounds under the Emperor's authority. The King's Guard were renamed to the Queen's Guard since they now serve a queen rather than a king, and they took their oath to protect not just Riella, but also her children with utmost loyalty. Every day, they trained rigorously, ensuring that they were prepared for any threat that might arise, even though they were in one of the safest places on the continent. "Do you think I could wield a sword like Viserys?" Daenerys continued, her eyes wide with hope. She didn't yet know the weight of the steel or the balance of a blade. All she knew was that her brother was becoming strong. Riella knelt beside her daughter, bringing them eye to eye. "Strength is not solely measured by the ability to wield a sword, my dear Dany. There are different kinds of power." Her voice was soothing yet firm, with a knowledge only a mother could possess. "Your strength may come from your heart or your mind." Just as she spoke, the clattering of wooden swords was reaching an end as Ser Alaric ducked under Viserys' wild swing and countered. Viserys staggered back, panting heavily as Ser Alaric planted the tip of his blade into the ground and rested his hands on it. Viserys knew what this meant and sheathed his sword, signaling the end of his training. "Good work today, Prince Viserys," Ser Alaric said. "You've improved since last week, though you still have miles to go." Viserys straightened his back as he declared, "I won't stop until I can best you, Ser Alaric." "Ambition is admirable," Alaric acknowledged with a nod. "But remember, raw power is nothing without control. The moment you let your emotions dictate your actions, that's when your enemy will find their opening." Viserys took these words to heart as he knew it would only help him improve. Returning to the palace, the three Targaryens were walking through the halls as they encountered Maximus and Merlin. Seeing Maximus, Daenerys ran towards him and latched onto his leg, hugging it tightly as she looked up at him. "Your Excellency," she shouted with a big smile on her face. Maximus reached down and ruffled her hair, smiling back. "But getting bigger and bigger every day, little dragon. Soon you'll be the one to challenge your brother in swordplay." Daenerys giggled, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Maybe we can have a tournament," she suggested, releasing his leg and spinning in a little dance as she envisioned herself dressed in armor, ready for battle. "Easy there," Maximus chuckled, kneeling down to her level. "Let's wait until you're a bit older before you start challenging knights. Besides, we wouldn't want your brother getting too cocky, would we?" Viserys smirked at the exchange between his sister and Maximus. "I would never be too cocky. I'll be the greatest knight in the whole world," he boasted, crossing his arms as he tried to appear regal. Merlin, standing slightly behind Maximus, couldn't help but interject with a grin. "The greatest knight? And what of strategy? A knight without cunning is merely a sword on a battlefield," she said, clearly teasing Viserys, who simply ignored her. "Maximus," Riella called out, "I must say this place is the greatest place I could hope for my children to grow up in. They get to go attend classes with other kids, socialize, learn skills, and have a straight path toward a better future, should they choose it. That's what I am aiming for, and this is what we agreed upon. To allow your children to form their own paths," he replied. "I just wish there was something that I could do to help out. For the past 3 years, she has felt a little guilty as she did nothing to repay everything that Maximus has done and will do for her and her children." Hearing this, Merlin interjected, "I have something for you to do, my lady, if you want to help out." "Do you really?" asked Riella. "Yes," Merlin replied as she turned to Maximus. "We could allow her to teach in the Academy of Excellence, allowing her to do something other than sit within the palace walls, and she can share her past with the students if she wishes, showing them how she used to live." Riella's eyes widened at the suggestion. "Teach at the Academy? You think they would benefit from my experiences?" she asked. Merlin nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. Your life in Westeros is rich with stories and lessons. It will provide a perspective they haven't encountered before. You could share tales of courage, resilience, and the struggles of ruling, as well as the strength that comes from love and family." Maximus stepped closer, placing his hand on her shoulder. "You should do it. You possess knowledge that many here would find invaluable. She gazed at her children, thinking about her decision for a second. In her heart, she wanted to do it, but her mind didn't know whether or not she could do it. But at the same time, it would allow her to do something, so ultimately she accepted. I would love to teach at the academy if you would allow it then, she answered. Good, Maximus said, turning towards Merlin. I'm sure you can handle all the paperwork and such. Merlin nodded as it was settled. The group continued to chat for a little while longer, with Maximus greeting Ser Barristan Selmy, the commander of the Queen's Guard. Ser Barristan had great respect towards Maximus and the way he ruled his empire, often thinking how he would probably have joined the Imperial army if he wasn't already sworn to his queen. He had traveled into the city multiple times and saw how lively the atmosphere of the city was compared to King's Landing. The people loved their emperor, and while he slightly considered some of them to be fanatics, he understood the things that Maximus had done to make himself seem like a deity to them. In the distance, the port of Sunspear came into view as 3 Imperial ships approached in a tight triangle formation. The lead ship was the Sovereign Blade, which is Maximus's own personal ship. On each side were the 2 fourth-rate class ships designated as escort ships when traveling through the sea. On the port, Prince Oberyn was waiting alongside a few house guards. The ship docked as the crew began to prepare for shore duty while Maximus was away. Oberyn Martell stepped forward as the ship's gangway lowered. "Welcome to Dorne, Emperor Maximus," he called out. The prince's face was filled with a mixture of respect and curiosity as he cast a glance at the Imperial entourage accompanying Maximus. 2 people particularly caught his attention. The first one was the female standing to Maximus's right who wore all black, with a black mask and hood that covered her face. The second one was possibly the most beautiful lady he had ever seen. She was wearing all black as well, but her face was uncovered with her black hair and glowing purple eyes, which made him even more curious as to who she was. "Thank you, Prince Oberyn," Maximus replied, stepping onto the dock. "It's nice to see the great city of Sunspear I've heard so much about." Oberyn extended a hand, his expression warm as he clasped Maximus's. "You honor us with your presence. I have long awaited this day. Dorne has much to offer, and I believe we can bring about a partnership that would benefit both Dorne and the Imperial Union." As he finished saying that, his gaze fell upon the armored knights escorting Maximus. He had seen them during his own unofficial visit to Heaven's Reach when he participated in one of the tournaments that take place weekly within the Colosseum. He never won, not even once, but he learned a lot from his fights and lost his right leg. He thought his life was over, until his leg was restored by one of the Imperial witches which he had heard the rumors about, but never saw them in person until that one time. "Partnerships are indeed vital in this world," Maximus replied, his eyes looking at the marketplace behind Oberyn. "I'm sure we have a lot to discuss, so shall we?" Oberyn nodded, gesturing for Maximus to follow him as they walked through the streets of Sunspear. "I must say," Oberyn began, "you have cultivated quite a reputation in Westeros. Many speak of your accomplishments, mainly the conquest of over half of the free cities, the dragons that and other flying creatures that fly above Heaven's Reach. The list just go on and on." Maximus smiled as he was aware of how some of the nobles of Westeros saw him. But how they saw him didn't matter to him, as it was the people who would be the final judge. Reputation is a double-edged sword, Prince Oberyn. While it can open doors, it also invites scrutiny and creates expectations. Oberyn chuckled lightly. "Indeed, my friend, we are a passionate people here in Dorne. If you stay long enough, you will see that our spirit is as fiery as our sun. You will also find that our ways may differ greatly from those of the North, or even King's Landing, but we value loyalty and honor above all, attributes I believe align well with your empire." Maximus and Oberyn talked for the remainder of the time until they arrived within a private room, where Prince Doran was waiting alongside Princess Elia. Prince Doran stood up, showing his respect to Maximus as he walked into the room. "Emperor Maximus, it's nice to finally meet you," Doran greeted. "Same here, Prince Doran," Maximus replied as he turned towards Princess Elia. "Princess Elia, I see you are in good health since being rescued. I'm glad to see that." Princess Elia bowed her head slightly at the mention of her rescue, as it is what saved her life from the Lannister forces who would have done God knows what when they found her and her children. Thank you, Emperor Maximus. Your men acted with great courage and decisiveness, she replied, her voice laced with gratitude towards Maximus. I will forever be in your debt. Maximus waved his hand dismissively. You owe me nothing, princess. Merely saving those who didn't deserve to die on that day, especially by those Lannister bastards. Dorne smiled appreciatively at Maximus. Your kindness resonates throughout our family's history, and it speaks volumes about the character of your empire. Many might believe us distant and aloof from mainland politics, but they fail to see the fire that burns underneath. Oberyn smirked at his brother's solemnity. Dorne has always been the cautious one, he jested. Perhaps, if it weren't for him, we would already be marching upon King's Landing to claim what is rightfully ours. Easy, brother, Dorne replied with a wry smile. We've already seen too much blood spilled because of reckless ambition. Let us not take vengeance now, but keep in mind the ones who have wronged us, for who knows what the future may hold. Maximus nodded, agreeing with this stance taken by Prince Dorne. Now, let's not talk about these things anymore. In your message, you mentioned deepening the ties between Dorne and the Empire. Dorne stated, his tone turning serious. Yes, while we don't have much of an established relationship, I believe we could start out with a trade agreement and then see where that takes us. Maximus replied, in exchange, Dorne can get exclusive access to our crops, high-quality weapons, alongside a few rare resources and such. The conversation lasted for about half an hour before the final terms were decided. Dorne would enter into a trade agreement with the Imperial Union, giving Dorne exclusive rights to receive the first shipments of anything exported into Westeros. Once the agreement was signed by both parties present, Dorne had grown curious about the two females whom Maximus brought with him. Also, I am curious about those two beautiful-looking women behind you. Ah, was all Maximus said as he pulled Lilith and Merlin closer to him upon seeing the eyes of both Prince Dorne and Prince Oberyn. This is Lilith. She is a witch and one of my personal bodyguards, he explained as he turned to Merlin. And this is Merlin, not a witch, but capable of using magic nonetheless. She is my assistant of sorts who performs a variety of roles. Both of them are very special to me. Lilith and Merlin saw what Maximus was doing and decided to play along. They leaned into his arms, sending a clear message to both Prince Dorne and Prince Oberyn. Magic? Prince Dorne questioned, as he had been hearing a lot about magic lately. It was hard to believe considering he never saw magic being used himself. Yes, would you like me to demonstrate? Prince Dorne's eyes widened slightly, a mixture of curiosity and caution. Demonstration, you say? I've always believed magic to be more myth than reality, he replied, leaning forward. Merlin smiled as she stood up and went to the center of the room and raised one of her hands. A soft glow began emanating from her fingertips, illuminating the room. I will show you a simple illusion, she declared. In an instant, the image of a small dragon formed as it began to circle around the room. Oberyn had seen this during his time in Heaven's Reach, but it still shocked him even now. By the gods, it appears the rumors are true. Dorne was even more surprised than Oberyn was. While it was only illusion magic, just seeing magic used in person was a different feeling than just hearing about in a story. For the remainder of the time, Dorne's thoughts were filled with how not to become an enemy of the Imperial Union and how to befriend them instead. Dorne didn't join in the war until it was too late, and even then, they didn't really join. They only sent troops to support Prince Rhaegar. They were still loyal to the Targaryens in a way and disliked the current king because of his ties with the Lannisters. Considering that the remaining members of House Targaryen, including the former queen, was hiding within the walls of Heaven's Reach, Prince Dorne saw a future where they could strike against the Lannisters and work alongside the Imperial Union to place House Targaryen back on the Iron Throne. Though this was all just speculation from Prince Dorne, it was still a possibility that he hoped would happen. After the meeting ended, Maximus was invited to tour the old palace of Dorne, which he gladly agreed to. In hopes of improving their relationship, Prince Dorne, Oberyn, and Princess Elia joined him on the tour. Watching from a window above, 14-year-old Princess Arian Martell stared at Maximus as he walked across the palace courtyard. Maximus had arrived in Essos in 281 AC after he died at the age of 20. Now 9 years later, 290 AC, he was 29 years old, about to reach his 30s. Arian always dreamed of one day marrying a knight alongside some other sexual fantasies, despite her age. She wanted to be like her Aunt Elia and marry both a knight and a prince, such as Prince Rhaegar. But unfortunately, that time might not come, seeing as the only prince that was alive right now is Prince Joffrey Baratheon, who was only 4 years old. But she knew her father's dislike of the crown, and the fact that she was 10 years older than the prince was also something that would be heavily looked at if such a thing was considered. Standing next to her was Tyene Sand, whom she considered a sister despite them both being cousins. They grew up together since Tyene was the daughter of her uncle Oberyn and have a very close bond with each other. "What are you looking at, Arian?" asked Tyene as she joined Arian and followed where her eyes were looking. Walking with her father Oberyn and her uncle Doran was a man who captured her attention with his black hair and the expensive-looking clothing that he wore. "Who is that?" she asked, turning towards Arian. "A/N. Don't know if I've ever posted his appearance, but here it is. MC's appearance. Supposedly, it's that emperor from Essos we've heard them talk about over the past few years," she replied. "Emperor Maximus. I think his name is," Arian continued, her voice filled with excitement and curiosity. "He doesn't look like an emperor, more like a knight." Tyene smirked. "You're always imagining knights and romantic tales, Arian. But yes, that's him. The stories say he's conquered cities with dragons and commands legions of loyal warriors." Arian leaned against the windowsill, her eyes fixed on Maximus. "He's handsome, I'll give him that. But there's something strange about him." Tyene tilted her head thoughtfully, her gaze lingering on Maximus as he paused to inspect a mosaic in the courtyard. "Imagine the adventures he must have had, the battles he's fought." Arian shot her cousin a look. "Don't get too attached to a dream, Tyene. Men like him don't settle down with Dornish girls. He's probably here to secure his empire's future, not romance." Before Tyene could reply, a knock came at the door. A maid entered, bowing slightly. "Princess Arian, Lady Tyene, Prince Doran requests your presence in the gardens. The Emperor has agreed to dine with the family this evening." Arian and Tyene exchanged glances. "Well, it seems we'll get a closer look at your mysterious emperor," Arian said. In the gardens, Maximus sat under the shade of a grand weeping willow, its golden leaves shining in the sunlight. Servants moved quietly around, setting a feast that showcased the best of Dorne's culinary delights. Doran, Oberyn, and Elia were already seated, engaging in light conversation while Maximus was talking with Merlin and Lilith about the other 7 kingdoms. When Arian and Tyene arrived, Doran immediately stood up to introduce them. "Ah, my daughter, Arian, and my niece, Doran said, gesturing toward them. "Emperor Maximus, allow me to present the next generation of House Martell." Arian bowed gracefully. "Emperor Maximus, it is an honor to meet you," she said. Tyene followed suit, her smile warm. "Welcome to Sunspear, Your Majesty. I hope our hospitality pleases you." Maximus turned his head slightly. "The honor is mine, Princess Arian, Lady Tyene. Dorne's beauty is matched only by its people," he said, looking at Elia, who blushed and turned away. Oberyn, ever the mischievous one, grinned. "Careful, Emperor. Flattery like that will have every noble in Dorne vying for your attention." Maximus chuckled softly. "Diplomacy requires a certain charm, does it not?" he replied, causing Oberyn and Doran to burst into laughter. "Indeed it does." As the evening progressed, the conversation flowed freely, touching on trade, history, the unique customs of Dorne, and a few things about Maximus. Arian found herself infatuated by Maximus's stories. Tyene, meanwhile, couldn't help but study him, trying to see what about this person screamed that he was an emperor. To her, he looked more like a knight than an emperor of an empire. Meanwhile, one of the attendants had slipped away from the party and into a secluded space. They wrote something down on a piece of paper and tied it to a raven before sending it in the direction of King's Landing. About 30 hours later, the raven arrived within the Red Keep of King's Landing, where Lord Varys had taken the message and read it. The Emperor of the Imperial Union has arrived within Sunspear and is having dinner with House Martell. The conversation mainly involved trade between the Imperial Union and Dorne, but also touched on alliances and shared ambitions. Emperor Maximus is accompanied by 2 women rumored to be magic users, one of whom demonstrated her abilities. His arrival has sparked interest among the Martells, particularly in their discussions of the Targaryen claim to the Iron Throne. Varys set the message down and leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The Emperor's presence in Dorne was an intriguing development, one that could shift the delicate balance of power in Westeros. He whispered to himself, "What game are you playing, Emperor Maximus?" Varys's thoughts were interrupted as a knock sounded at his chamber door. A young servant entered and bowed. "My lord, a message from Queen Cersei. She wishes to speak with you at once." Varys nodded, carefully placing the raven's message into a hidden compartment in his desk. "Inform her grace that I will attend to her shortly." As the servant left, Varys allowed himself a moment of reflection. The arrival of the Emperor, especially the one with rumored magic and dragons, would undoubtedly alarm the king and the other members of the small council. His little birds and other contacts were able to operate within the Imperial Union, but they don't have much to report on, as it was impossible to infiltrate the Imperial Palace in Heaven's Reach. And the other houses within the Imperial Union didn't have anything of importance that they wanted to know. He remembers his brief time spent talking to the Emperor before, when he was just a simple business owner. Never would he have imagined that a simple business owner would carve out his own empire within Essos. Putting his thoughts aside for the moment, he quickly left to see what the Queen wanted. Back in Dorne, Maximus had spent the last day with the members of House Martell until it was time for him to return to Essos. As he was about to leave, Prince Doran had brought up a proposal that surprised Maximus, as he was not expecting such a thing. He offered the hand of his daughter in marriage to unite Dorne and the Imperial Union in marriage, which would establish a strong connection between both Dorne and the Imperial Union. Maximus at first was shocked to hear such an offer, but also understood the benefits. Both Lilith and Merlin had whispered in his ears that it was a good offer that would eventually bring Dorne into the hands of the Imperial Union, if he was to agree to it. The only thing Maximus was worried about was her age. Coming from a world where marriage had become a more normal thing for people starting at 18, he was hesitant to accept it, since in his mind it was wrong, but for this world it was normal. So, he proposed that he would consider it once she reaches 20, as long as she stays pure, then a union between their 2 houses is possible. Prince Doran nodded, understanding how ambitious such a proposal was, but was glad that it was something that is possible in the future. After having that brief conversation, Maximus departed on his ship, heading back to Imperial-controlled land. Prince Doran told his daughter, whom he had learned was interested in the Emperor, about what he said about the marriage proposal. She was ecstatic at the idea of not only marrying a person who looked like a knight, but he was also the powerful ruler of an empire. The only problem was he would only consider it once she reached 20, so there was no guarantee that he would accept, but you can't fault a girl for wanting to try. She vowed to stay pure until she was 20 to see if the Emperor would marry her or not. /in. By this time, Arianne is 14, and according to sources, she was 14 when she lost her virginity to Demon Sand. As of this point, she hadn't lost it yet, and with the marriage proposal, the idea is for her to stay pure and potential marry Maximus sometime in the future, but who knows what the future is planned for her. Prince Oberyn wanted to return to the imperial capital to see more of these beauties that the Emperor had, but his duty to his house came first. He had some things to deal with in Sunspear before he could embark for Essos for another one of his adventures. In Volantis, the 4 nobles' houses which were granted mercy by Maximus and allowed to continue to exist and have since proven their loyalty to the Imperial Union. They were completely captured by the knowledge and industrial advancements that were brought to Volantis, allowing them another way to make money. The public squares and markets bustled with new inventions like steam power machinery, which was permitted by Maximus himself to be sold publicly, and irrigation techniques that brought prosperity to the economy of Volantis. The nobles, despite having been forced to serve under Maximus, were still nobles and were treated as such throughout the Imperial Union, despite the initial forcible annexation of Volantis. Maximus' fair and progressive style of ruling had earned him much admiration from those who served under him. They saw how much his rule had changed Volantis for the better, and they were more than willing to support him in his endeavors. The port of Volantis has become a central hub for ships, as hundreds of ships can be seen within the port on a daily basis. Over half were trade and fishing ships coming and going from either the open sea or from down the Rion River, while the rest were the ships of the Imperial Navy. In addition to having a trade port, Volantis also became the central headquarters for the Imperial Navy, with an Imperial Naval Academy already built to foster in the next generation of naval sailors. In the Gulf of Grief, the first Imperial fleet, led by Admiral Thorne, was currently blockading the island city of New Guise. It was one of the last few remaining slave cities within Imperial reach, and would open the door to Carve, where the warlocks resided alongside the House of the Undying. New Guise would be annexed by the Imperial Union and become an important city to have. Standing on the deck of her flagship, the Imperial Fury, Admiral Thorne watched as the fleet bombarded the city. They had already destroyed the small fleet the city had, and now they were just softening up the defenses of the city before the ground forces landed. Standing next to her was Achilles, general of the 5th Imperial Legion. General Achilles. Admiral Thorne greeted him with a nod, not taking her eyes off the city. The man before her was a tall, imposing figure known for his strategic expertise and courage in battle. Will your men be ready to advance once we've cleared the city's main defenses? Achilles smiled at the question. Our men are always ready, Admiral. They are eager to claim victory for the Imperial Union. Admiral Thorne chuckled as the sound of the crashing waves and artillery fire could be heard. That's what I like to hear, General. This place is to become a military hub connecting us to the far eastern part of the continent. Achilles nodded thoughtfully. The strategic value of this city cannot be overstated. Once it's under Imperial control, we'll have a gateway to the Jade Sea and an anchor for operations in the east. The Emperor's vision stretches far beyond these shores. New Guise is just the beginning. She paused, glancing at Achilles. But we'll need the cooperation of the Giscari people if we want lasting peace here. They'll come to see the wisdom of joining the Union. Once they realize that the Empire doesn't destroy but rebuilds and improves, they'll have no choice but to embrace the future. Achilles himself had already seen the effect of this and knew it would work. Thorne displayed a small smile. Your optimism is refreshing, General. Let's hope their stubborn pride doesn't delay progress. As they spoke, a runner approached, saluting crisply. Admiral Thorne, General Achilles. Scouts report that the city's outer defenses are weakening. The bombardment has breached sections of the wall, and the enemy is beginning to retreat toward the inner sanctum. Thorne's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Good. Signal the fleet to maintain fire on their strongholds. We'll launch the ground assault at dawn. She turned to Achilles. Prepare your men, General. By this time tomorrow, New Guise will be under Imperial control. Achilles nodded. Copy that, Admiral. As the runner departed, Thorne and Achilles returned their attention to the besieged city. Fires burned along the docks, casting a hellish glow over the bay. The cries of the wounded enemies could be heard across the fleet. Thorne spoke again, her voice quieter. Do you ever wonder, Achilles, if we're remembered as liberators or conquerors? Achilles looked up into the sky before he replied. History will judge us by the legacy we leave behind. If we build a better future for these people, they'll remember us as liberators. Thorne nodded, understanding the idea behind what Achilles said. Let's make sure we give them something worth remembering. By dawn, the 5th Imperial Legion was assembled on the shores of New Guise. Row upon row of disciplined soldiers of various different races awaited Achilles' command, their armor shining in the first light of day. The remaining Giscari legions, weary and battered, clung desperately to the hope of repelling the invaders. Achilles raised his sword, the imperial banner unfurling behind him. Soldiers of the Empire, today we bring justice to New Guys. No longer will this city be a bastion of slavery and oppression. Fight with honor, and let the world see the strength of the Imperial Union once again. The Legion roared in response, the sound carrying over the battlefield as they charged forward. As the battle commenced, Admiral Thorne watched from the deck of her flagship. Her thoughts drifted to the Emperor and the grand vision he had set in motion. New Guys would soon fall, and with it, another chapter in the story of the Imperial Union would be written, a story of ambition, conquest, and an unyielding pursuit of progress. Sitting within a small council meeting, Lord Tyrell and Ser Davos had permanently returned from their visit to Heaven's Reach. Now, they were asked to discuss what they had gathered from their time spent there. While everybody was aware of some things, it would be better for the people who personally saw them to explain things. Now, let's begin, Robert said, motioning for Mace to get on with their findings. Mace took a deep breath before he began. To put plainly, Your Grace, the Imperial Union far outmatches us in all ways. They have not only dragons, but other flying creatures that could be seen flying around their cities. Robert's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Other flying creatures? Do tell. Yes, Davos interjected. Creatures that I have only heard about in myths and legends. Griffins, wyverns, even some other flying creatures which I have never heard of or seen before. Their skies are filled with beasts straight from fables. The room fell silent at his words. The idea that besides dragons, they had other dangerous flying creatures was mind-boggling. It was already well known throughout the Seven Kingdoms that they had dragons, as the whispers of traveling merchants could be stopped. Yet these other creatures were a mystery to them. Mace Tyrell picked up from where Davos left off. Land-wise as well, they have an army of strange-looking species, possibly from Eastern Essos or other places under their command. The most notable of all, in my opinion, is the ones they call the dwarves, who are essentially half-man. They are stout and stocky, Your Grace, but do not underestimate their strength. The dwarves are masterful craftsmen and warriors. They have built fortifications throughout Heaven's Reach of a toughness and beauty I've never seen in all my years. Murmurs erupted across the room at Mace's description. Half-men who could also fight against their best warriors? It was difficult to believe. Quiet, Robert barked, instantly silencing the room. Continue, he commanded, his gaze focused on Ser Davos. And it's not just soldiers, Ser Davos added grimly. They have sages that can perform feats of healing far beyond what maesters can achieve. Those potions that we buy from them are just a small cream of the crop. The meeting went on for a long time with some breaks taken to fully grasp the situation. In the end, Robert decided to remain cautious towards them because of their safeguarding of the last few Targaryen house members. As for Dorne, he had been counseled years ago not to try and kill Princess Elia and her Targaryen children because of the conflict it would start between Robert's house and numerous other houses. Especially now, since they just had to beat the Iron Islands, who had tried to declare independence from the Iron Throne. That was a year ago, and they were still on edge for any more conflicts that would pop up. If it wasn't for Jon Arryn, then King Robert's reign might have been ended much sooner due to his decisions, which would have come back to bite him in the ass. At one of the train terminals in Heaven's Reach, a magic train had just arrived, opening its doors and allowing the passengers to disembark. Among them was a merchant by the name of Norio Paroles and his family, who had traveled all the way from Volantis to see the city of Heaven's Reach for the first time. Their eyes widened in amazement as they stepped out onto the platform, looking around at the vast structure with its amazing architecture and strange carvings. The terminal was filled with a diverse crowd consisting mostly of humans, but also off-duty elves, Uruk-hai guards, and dwarves performing maintenance tests on the train after each stop. Nerario's wife, Anera, held their young daughter Lyanne's hand tightly at the sight of the Uruk-hai, who looked scary to her. Norio had received a rundown of what to expect from other merchants and was told not to be scared, as nothing would happen to them as long as they didn't break any rules. Turning toward his wife, he reassured her with a gentle squeeze. "Don't fret, Anera. Those are just the city's guards who serve the Emperor directly. Remember what we were told before arriving. All are welcome here in Heaven's Reach. Despite his calming words, Norio himself couldn't help but feel awestruck by his surroundings as well. Their home city of Atlantis was considered vast and was being rebuilt with the same architecture, yet couldn't remotely compare to the grandeur of Heaven's Reach. A sudden buzzing sound from above drew their attention. Norio looked up to see a hovering carriage of brass and glass descending from a nearby building. It gently stopped on the platform beside them. The door slid open and out stepped an Imperial officer, who Norio recognized as a human with quite high rank from his uniform, mentioning a rank unknown to Norio, Colonel. The officer was followed by 2 Urukai carrying boxes of goods, which they proceeded to unload onto the platform. As he was busy looking at the officer, another merchant who recognized Norio approached him and his family. "Norio, is that you?" The man called out. His name was Darius, an old friend and fellow merchant. "Darius," Norio replied, meeting his old friend's embrace. His wife and daughter greeted Darius as well, who seemed pleasantly surprised by Lien's growth. "Judging from your wide eyes and slack jaws," Darius motioned towards the Urukai and the Imperial officer in the background, "I gather this is your first time in Heaven's Reach." Norio nodded and Darius laughed heartily, giving Norio a playful slap on the back. "Well, you'll get used to it, friend. Heaven's Reach will make the grandest of cities look like paupers' shacks," Darius said, pulling back and directing his attention to the horizon. "And if I may add," he whispered, leaning close to Norio, "there's serious opportunity for trade here." "That's what we're here for, Darius," Norio responded, adopting a more businesslike tone. "Good, but let's walk and talk while I take you around the city," suggested Darius. Norio agreed as they followed Darius out of the train station and into city. For the next few hours, they walked around the city, with Darius showing them the various marketplaces, the guild houses, the ports of arrival and departure for various goods. He introduced them to the different traders and artisans, all telling stories of their time in Heaven's Reach. Along with this, they had seen the towering buildings in Heaven's Reach, some of which were more than 10 stories high. They also saw the Imperial Stadium, which was used for many of the sports that Maximus introduced to keep the Dothraki, who were a warrior-based people, entertained. Separate from the stadium, they saw the Colosseum, which was used for gladiator matches and tournaments, something that was familiar to Norio from tales of the old Valyrian Empire, yet executed on a much grander scale here in Heaven's Reach. And then there were the gardens, green fields stretching as far as the eyes could see, filled with plants and fruits, some exotic even to a well-traveled merchant like Norio. As the day came to end, they found themselves in front of the entrance to the Imperial Palace. Well, not the entrance to the palace directly, but to the area which was considered the palace grounds. Separating the palace walls from the rest of the city was a small river which flowed all around the palace. The only way across were a handful of iron bridges which were guarded by 2 giants and more than a dozen guards for each gate. These guards were a mix of the most elite soldiers that Maximus had in his possession. As Norio and his family saw the massive giant who stood as still as a statue, Lien had become infatuated with the massive giant and started running towards the gate. Darius tried to stop her, but she was too fast and had managed to reach the first set of guards before anyone could catch up. The first 2 guards, who were the Reherm Royal Guard, were taken aback by the small child rushing towards them. But as they realized it was merely a curious youngster, their expressions softened. "Whoa there, little one," a guard chuckled as Lien came to a stop, staring up at the towering giant with excitement. The lead guard pointed towards the giant, a smirk forming on his face. "Up there's our friend Grimner," he explained. The giant performed a slight nod towards the small child, causing Lien to giggle gleefully. Norio and Anara finally caught up to their adventurous daughter, out of breath but relieved to see her safe. "I apologize, my lord, for my daughter's behavior," Norio said, bowing respectfully. The guards merely waved off his apology, exchanging glances amongst themselves. They have seen countless children react with innocent awe towards seeing something that they had only heard about in myth. "It's all right. She's not the first child to be curious," replied the guard as he waved Grimner to come closer. Grimner reached his hand out and gently patted Lien's head, who giggled. Meanwhile, Darius smiled at Norario's reaction. "Don't worry, Norario," he whispered to his friend. "The Emperor treats his subjects with fairness and affection, even those who aren't quite subjects yet." Reassured by the exchange between Darius and the guards, Norario sighed as he watched Lien having fun. He looked at his wife and could see in her face how much she wanted to stay here in Heaven's Reach. Looking back at his daughter, he thought about moving his business to Heaven's Reach to keep seeing the two people he loved more than anything smile every day. Inside the palace, Maximus was sitting in his office, currently trying to decide what to do with new guys now that Achilles and Admiral Thorne had successfully taken it. The Giscari Iron Legions had been mostly wiped out due to them fighting until the last man, leaving only a few hundred left from the thousands of soldiers who were defending the city. Now he was deciding on what to do next. He already planned to change the name of New Guys to Port Alexandria and then make the city a central hub for connecting the Empire's sea trade to that of the Far East. There was already a land route which was connected to the Far East, but the route was dangerous and littered with all types of bandits and dangerous wildlife. A sea route would be faster and safer and allow Maximus a doorway to investigate the city of Carve. Port Alexandria would become the central hub for the new Eastern Fleet that would form, while Volantis would be the central port for all Imperial naval activity, and Mir was for the Western Fleet. Drawing up the plans he began to write on the sheet of paper all the things he wanted done to the city and the next steps they would take. One of those steps would be to take the Basilisk Isles and expand further into the Red Waste closer to Carth and the Far East. Once he was done drawing up his plans, a servant knocked on the door and brought him his dinner for the night. After dropping off his dinner, the young servant walked behind Maximus and began to message his shoulders. Taking a break from his work, he enjoyed the message for a short while then ate his food. After eating his food, he decided to call a night and took a bath before getting into bed. Tomorrow, an envoy from the Emperor of ET will arrive to improve the relationship between the two empires. The western and eastern half of Essos had been separated for too long, and after sending a messenger to the Emperor of ET, he also wanted to bring the two sides closer together. While war was fun and all, for the winning side at least, it was not always the answer to everything. Sometimes diplomacy was preferred over rather than taking over new land and then decided what to do with it next. As the next day rolled around, Maximus got up early morning and did his normal daily routine, which consisted of him washing his face, brushing his teeth with the mint toothpaste he introduced throughout his empire, and then getting dressed in some custom-made royal robes. Meeting him outside of his room was a few maids. One of them held a plate with some eggs and toast in her hand. Maximus grabbed a piece of toast as they walked down the hallway. "Do we know when the envoy is supposed to arrive?" he asked. "Should be a few hours from now, Your Excellency. They just arrived at the train station in Vizduthrak about an hour ago and should board the magic train and arrive here around midday," informed one of the maids. "Good. Who is going to meet with him?" Because it wasn't going to be him, since it was an envoy and not the Emperor of ET himself. Chancellor Allerin has decided to meet with the envoy to discuss trade agreements and cultural exchange, Your Excellency. If all goes well, we might see an influx of exotic resources from the east, the young maid said. Maximus nodded at this update, finishing his toast as they continued their walk towards his study. "Any reports from Achilles?" Maximus asked, shifting focus now on military updates. An older maid spoke up. "A raven arrived just an hour ago, Your Excellency. They've started fortifying Port Alexandria as per your instructions, and slowly civilians are returning to their homes. There's peace now. That's good news. Those people deserve some stability, especially with the changes that are to come. Not only was the city renamed, but the reforms that would be implemented would be very innovative, at least for the people, but it will benefit them greatly." As they reached the study, another servant was already waiting outside with a map detailing the new things that have been built or are currently being built throughout Imperial territory. It also showed neighboring regions, such as the remaining free cities that Maximus has yet to conquer. Bravos, Pintos, and Cohor were on friendly terms with the Imperial Union, with several agreements being established with each free city. bravos, and pintos, since they were situated on the port, had agreements allowing both their own cities and the Imperial Union trade ships to dock at their ports and conduct trade with each other. Cohor, on the other hand, was more inland and had a great number of tradesmen and craftsmen. Thus, it mainly dealt with providing certain types of goods for the Union in return for something else. Norvos had isolated itself within the mountains, as the other free cities had stopped trading with them out of fear of their relationship with the Imperial Union. The only reason the city is able to maintain itself is because of its trade with Lorith. But the recent attacks on Imperial caravans traveling through the region had forced Maximus to make a decision. All caravans that were traveling within Imperial territory could register to be able to fly the Imperial flag as they conduct their business. Most caravans and traders signed off for this and flew the Imperial flag to scare bandits on land or pirates on the sea. However, even with this, the soldiers of Norvos have attacked 3 caravans within the last 2 months. This clearly wasn't an act of banditry. If it were bandits, they would not dare to attack a flag that bore the symbol of the Imperial Union. This was clearly an act of provocation, an act that Maximus intended to act on. The people of Norvos needed to understand that he wouldn't stand for such blatant transgressions over his territory and people. Have Merlin take the Black Wings and any other forces she needs to take over Norvos, he commanded. Norvos, because of its position in the mountains, didn't have that big of a population, so it could only field at most 5,000 to 10,000 soldiers. Merlin and a few witches riding on top of the Black Wings were more than enough to force the city into submission. One of the maids hastily left the room to deliver the message to Merlin. Merlin, who was Maximus's assistant, was officially appointed as the Emperor's hand when they returned to the city some time ago. And she would certainly relish the challenge of conquering an entire city with a small number of forces. After staying in the study for another hour, it was time for him to do his daily training to increase his magic mastery. As midday rolled around, the envoy from ET had arrived within the palace and was transferred to a room where Allerin was already waiting for him. Because of the language difference, the envoy from ET, Gu Qin, brought his own translator to be able to communicate clearly during his visit. The meeting between Chancellor Allerin and Gu Qin was long and fraught with negotiations over trade agreements, diplomatic intricacies, and cultural exchanges. Maximus was informed, later that evening, that progress had been made. A mutual agreement had been reached, a handful of ED's unique resources in exchange for technology. Allerin was in the process of drawing up the treaty, which would be sent to ET for the Emperor's approval. If all went well, they could expect an influx of Eastern exotic goods by the coming summer. Approaching the airspace around Norvos, Merlin was riding on top of one of the Black Wings alongside a few witches and a handful of witch elves. Below, they could already see the city of Norvos, nestled in the mountains like a jewel amongst rocks. Unlike other cities, Norvos seemed to blend seamlessly with its surroundings, its stone structures mimicking the mountainous formations. But today was not about admiring scenery. Begin the assault, Merlin commanded her forces. As one, the witches and witch elves began chanting, their harmonious voices merging into a chorus that echoed within the mountains. In response to their chants, the skies darkened ominously above Norvos. Clouds formed unnaturally, and lighting could be seen within them. Then came a downpour, not of rain or hail, but of fireballs. Roaring flames descended upon Norvos, igniting rooftops and causing widespread panic among the citizens. Dark smoke erupted from the city, almost cloaking it from view within a matter of minutes. Merlin's forces then descended upon the burning city like vultures diving for prey. The Black Wings flew close to the ground, allowing the witches to jump off onto the streets of the city. Once on the ground, they conjured golems from the surrounding stone and earth, creatures of imposing size that took to the streets with thundering steps. It was a shock and awe strategy, and it worked to near perfection. Citizens fled their homes in panic, fleeing from enemy that had descended upon their city. The Norvos soldiers were unprepared for such an attack, trained to defend their city from ground invasions through terrain advantage. Yet they were hopeless against an aerial assault and surprise attack from within their own city. Resistance was put up, as futile as it was against the witches. The commander of the Norvos force rallied his men at the fortress temple to protect the bearded priests who were inside, and trying to counterattack as best as he could, but it was too late. "Round them up," Merlin commanded telepathically, watching from high above on top her black wing. "Take no life unless necessary." This was a takeover, not a massacre. Golems and witches were powerful, but precise. They used their strength to contain the people. Down in the streets, people were cowering, their faces reflecting their shock and fear. The attackers had overwhelmed the soldiers defending the city like they were nothing. Instead of swords and shields, these people wielded magic. You couldn't use a spear against a fireball. As the witches started moving the city's inhabitants into the central plaza, Merlin took flight once again to the fortress temple. She knew that the bearded priests were probably hiding within their fortress, and she wanted to hurry up and get rid of them. Descending from the sky, Merlin landed in front of the temple just as the doors swung open, revealing the once mighty and unchallenged rulers of Norvos, its religious leaders. Their pious garb paled in comparison to Merlin's imposing presence. They were being escorted by slaves who looked at Merlin in fear because of her dark appearance. "Who's this wench that dares intrude upon the sanctity of our sacred grounds?" one of the priests yelled. Merlin didn't say anything and only stood there as the heads of the bearded priests were chopped off, causing the slaves to cower in fear. Behind them were the Shadow Hand agents who had already infiltrated the city years ago. She was going to kill them herself, but after sensing them nearby, she just left it up to them. "My lady," one of the agents greeted, "these are all the bearded priests present, while the other magisters have already been captured and are killed. Any guards have also already been dealt with around the temple." Merlin nodded. She was quite impressed by their work, as this was the first time she had seen it firsthand. "Good. I'll handle the rest, and call for a garrison force to be sent." The Shadow Hand agents bowed before they disappeared. With the city basically captured, she sent a raven back to Heaven's Reach to report their victory and a call for a garrison force to be sent to the city. 1 year later, 291 AC. Surveying the Isle of Tears, Dane II Ironfoot and his legion of dwarves had just arrived in the region to claim it for the Imperial Union. Near the shore of the isle, about 40 Imperial ships were standing by, waiting for the builders to finish setting up a makeshift dock so that the ships could offload their supplies onto shore. Meanwhile, a separate force was sent on the mainland to the south of the isle. Their mission was to establish a base there, which would be a supply point for further expanding onto the continent of Sothorios. Overlooking the construction, Dane was deep in thought. These lands were unfamiliar, yet the presence of his legion's dwarves and the reassuring vessels of their fleet anchored offshore lent a sense of familiarity, like the foothills of Erebor. Using their advanced engineering tools, the builders, which were a combination of Dothraki, freemen, and dwarves, were steadily making progress, erecting towering structures with sturdy foundations. Once they get more supplies and more people sent from the mainland, the isle would be transformed into a fortress. While this was happening, Bjorn was leading the separate force in the south. His target was a stretch of land that had easy access to open ocean and was ideal for commercial docks. As one of the patrols were securing the perimeter around their camp, they encountered a tribe of native people who seemed quite hostile. Their initial contact resulted in a small skirmish happening, leaving several of the tribesmen dead as the patrol group managed to make it back. Bjorn, upon hearing this, decided to deploy more scouts to gain a deeper understanding of this tribe's strength and tactics. Not only were they in an unknown land with unknown people, but they also didn't know what type of abilities the natives had. This didn't deter Bjorn from continuing their mission. They were well prepared for conflict. Not only did they come armed to the teeth with superior weapons, but they also had experienced warriors and witches within their ranks who had fought in many battles back on their homeland. Dane, upon receiving word of the skirmish from a raven, immediately sent more soldiers and 2 witches to support Bjorn just in case the natives had any surprising abilities or could also use magic. The tribesmen, recovering and infuriated by the death of their fellow tribe members, planned retaliatory attacks against the invaders. Assembled within the center of their village, the tribesmen painted symbols of war across their bodies, invoking their ancestral spirits for strength and guidance. The total number of people in this tribe was about 1,200. 700 of the tribesmen were warriors who protected the city from other tribes, hunted for food, and patrolled the surrounding region. The rest comprised of women, children, and elders. Survival was brutal, the way it had been for generations in this unforgiving environment. But now they had another threat to deal with, the invaders, who didn't look like any tribesmen they had encountered before. Some people started to call them armored half-men due to the armor the dwarves wore. While an insult for sure, as calling a dwarf a half-man was akin to a grave offense, the dwarves themselves cared less for pleasantries and more for their mission, conquering lands and building fortresses in the name of the Imperial Union. The next morning, the tribesmen launched their attack on the coastal fortress, which was still under construction. However, Bjorn was prepared for such an attack and had already set up makeshift defenses around the construction site. Using the trees to mask their approach, the tribesmen managed to get close before they engaged a patrol of 4 dwarves, killing 3 of them, while the last one managed to run back to the fortress to warn them of the attack. Behind the makeshift wooden walls, the elven archers had seen one of the dwarves running frantically towards the entrance. A horn sounded, echoing across the makeshift fortress. Bjorn stepped out of his tent, his eyes scanning the tree line. Based off yesterday's events, he knew this had to be the tribesmen that his patrol had encountered. "Archers to the walls!" Bjorn shouted, his voice sounding across the fortress. "Warriors, to your positions. Witches, prepare your spells." The dwarves, elves, and witches within the camp scrambled into action. The elven archers climbed swiftly onto elevated platforms, preparing their arrows. Dwarven warriors formed tight shield walls near the main gate. Among them, the witches began chanting in low tones. The tribesmen's war cries erupted from the tree line as they charged forward, a tide of painted bodies armed with crude weapons. They moved with a ferocity born of desperation and vengeance, their determination evident in every step they took. The first volley of arrows rained down from the walls, striking their intended target. Several tribesmen fell, but their numbers were vast compared to the 400 men Bjorn had under him. When they reached the wooden barricades, they hurled themselves against it, hacking at the defenses with axes and spears. After a short while, the tribesmen had breached a section of the barricade and started to pour through. The dwarves met them head-on, stopping them from spreading into the camp, their shields absorbing the initial impact. The dwarves at the front stabbed, with some using short swords or axes. Dozens of the tribesmen were killed within seconds, with many more falling as the witches unleashed their spells. Fire and lightning had rained down upon the attacking force, causing the tribesmen to become scared at. But their leaders shouted for them to keep fighting, shouting things like, "For the ancestors," or "For the fallen." But their efforts were not enough. The witches summoned some golems, which they used to break the front lines of the tribesmen and sent them running in the opposite direction. As they ran back to the safety of the tree line, the elven archers rained down another volley of arrows. Dozens more died as they retreated, leaving a trail of dead bodies leading towards the tree line. Bjorn watched as the tribesmen retreated into the forest. He felt a sense of relief wash over him, relieved that the enemy was a bunch of primitives and not a properly trained army. With the battle over, he began to create a new perimeter around the camp, while having the witches keep an eye on the enemy. He wanted to know where they were at all times and if they were going to attack again. He also sent word back to Dane about the attack and their victory. In total, they had only lost 4 men, compared to the dozens that the enemy suffered. Receiving the message from Bjorn, Dane had sent a raven to Heaven's Reach requesting additional forces to be sent due to hostile natives. Heaven's Reach, parrying one of the attacks from Ianwe. Maximus feinted an attack from the left, which would fool a normal swordsman, but not Ianwe. He quickly stepped back to avoid the false strike, and then countered with a swift and powerful vertical swing. Anticipating the counterattack, Maximus parried Ianwe's sword once more, sending out the sound of 2 magic-enhanced swords clashing throughout the courtyard. We had a smile on his face as Maximus's progress was going well. Compared to when he first started, we saw a significant improvement in his magic abilities and his skills with his sword. And under We's suggestion, Maximus also learned to use a secondary weapon of his choosing, which turned out to be a spear. In the midst of their training session, a raven arrived and landed on the small little raven house, which was built for the ravens. It was a small shack which offered the ravens a place to rest and eat as they traveled across the empire. Pausing their training, a servant had taken the message tied around its leg and brought it to Maximus. Grabbing the piece of paper and opening it, Maximus saw that it was from Dane. Natives attacked one of our fortresses being built on the coast, but we held them off and they suffered heavy losses. They have several hundred people in this tribe, but considering this is a new land, we can expect several more tribes, some of which may be larger than this one. Maximus knew very well that these tribesmen were simply defending their own lands, reacting out of fear and anger at unknown invaders. But if he cared about things such as this, then he would have never sent Dane to establish a fortress on the continent. He handed the message back to the servant. Approve his request and send a raven to Illyria, sending 4,000 more soldiers to Sithorios. Maximus ordered. The servant bowed and left to carry out their orders. They would write up the message and then bring it back to him for the final signature. Writing was one of the most widely taught things in the Empire. Even if most people didn't need to write every day, it was still good to have that skill and knowledge. As the servant left, we had ended their training for the day. Maximus walked to the baths to wash up, followed by a group of maids. Living in luxury was something he came from in his previous life, and now it was something he could not imagine being without. While there was definitely a luxury difference, there was nothing that he couldn't attain in this world. As the maids washed his body, he looked at the prompt for his magic proficiency, which has reached 46%. He had 5 years left to reach 100% and complete the trials, giving him 2 years to prepare for the invasion. 3 of these 5 years would be spent reaching 100%, while the other 2 would be spent completing the 4 trials to ascend to a demigod to stand a chance at beating the Godroller. Nyxera, Maximus's greatest companion and the greatest ally that he had. Her potential and abilities were wasted because of how weak the enemies they had to face have been. Unlike the dragons that the Targaryen or even the Valyrians had, Nyxera could use both fire and lightning abilities. And her abilities weren't just limited to breathing fire or lightning. She hasn't had to use the full extent or even 50% of her power since she was summoned. This was a good thing, as it meant there weren't many powerful enemies out there that required her to use her full power. Flying high above heaven's reach, Nyxera, alongside her 10 children, which have hatched from the eggs she laid over the last 7 years since she was brought to this world. 4 of them were females, while the other 6 were males. She was currently training them on how to fight with their rider and protect the Empire from above, the key to controlling aerial battlefields. Unlike Nyxera herself, her children were many versions of herself and would not reach her size for centuries. Remember, your vision is sharper than any hawk, and you can fly higher than any bird, Nyxera said in a language that only the dragons could understand. Patience, coordination, those are your greatest weapons. The adolescent dragons swooped and dived, practicing breathing fire and lightning in rhythmic patterns. On their back, their riders had their own training, which involved learning how to fight in the air. As an Imperial dragon rider, they were not just required to learn how to ride the dragon, but also how to utilize the dragon to fight both ground targets and aerial targets. For aerial targets, the dragon riders were trained on how to skillfully jump from dragon to dragon and fight on their backs. After that, they learned how to use the dragon to swoop in on ground targets, allowing them to eliminate the commanders of armies either before the battle started or during the battle. The Imperial dragon riders trained diligently, honing their craft tirelessly. In time, as they gained proficiency in their skills, a bond began to form between human and beast, a deep trust that this bond would be their greatest asset when the time for actual combat came. The children of Nyxera were named after her, each carrying the title Nyx before their individual names. The females were called Nyxina, Nyxera II, Nyxera 3, and Nyxova, while the males were named Nixon, Nixis, Nixer, Nixiel, Nixfin, and Nixer. Much like their mother, all 10 of them had the ability to breathe both fire and lightning. For the wyverns, their training took place in the imperial city of Silvermere. Silvermere was one of the many cities established within the Dothraki Sea to spread out the massive number of people who lived in the region. The city was specifically designed as a place to house the imperial wyverns, which numbered 500 in total. Due to the large number of wyverns that were growing per year, Maximus had the witches come up with a way to keep the egg alive but not hatch due to the problem with having so many wyverns. 500 of them was already a massive number of wyverns that needed to be fed and kept under control. The wyverns were less autonomous than the dragons, requiring more direct control from their riders. Their training included guidance on how to command their wyvern in battle, as well as techniques for aerial combat. The difficulty came not only from the necessity of learning to control a massive beast, but also from the need to coordinate with other wyvern riders in large-scale engagements. Much like the dragon riders, however, they formed intimate bonds with their beasts over time, and these bonds allowed them to work together seamlessly in battle. While the dragons lead the aerial defense of Heaven's Reach, the wyverns operated as a rapid response force for all the areas under Imperial control. At any given time, 2 wyverns and their riders are assigned to each city within the Imperial Union, with the rest being stationed at Silvermere on standby in case they were needed. At the port of Myr, King Robert and Queen Cersei had just arrived with his king's guards and the rest of his royal entourage for their trip to Heaven's Reach. Jon Arryn had recommended that Robert visit Heaven's Reach to get a better understanding of the Imperial Union. Accompanied by Jaime Lannister, Robert had left the responsibilities of ruling kings landing in Jon Arryn's hands. The port bustled with activity as sailors scrambled to load their goods onto the ships. The smell of salt water and fish filled the air as they made their way through the docks. At the end of the docks, a witch by the name of Ariadne awaited their arrival with a few Imperial knights. Her role was to act as the official representative and personally escort the king, the queen, and their entourage from Myr to Heaven's Reach. "Welcome, King Robert Baratheon," Ariadne greeted him with a respectful nod. "I am here to escort you personally on behalf of the Emperor." Robert grunted, his eyes watching the witch warily. He recognized the witch in front of him as all of them wore the same style of clothes. "A witch, didn't think your Emperor would send such a powerful person to greet us." His voice was as gruff as ever. Ariadne smiled, unbothered by his tone. "Our Emperor values efficiency, Your Grace. My magic ensures your journey will be swift and safe. It is, after all, a long way to Heaven's Reach." Cersei stepped forward, her eyes narrowed as she studied Ariadne. "Safe, you say? Let's hope so. It's not every day we entrust our lives to strangers. Nor is it every day that strangers trust their lives to an empire," Ariadne replied smoothly, meeting Cersei's gaze without flinching. "Rest assured, Queen Cersei, you will see firsthand why the Imperial Union has no equal." Robert snorted, half amused, half skeptical. "Big words. Let's hope your empire lives up to them." He gestured for his entourage to follow, as Ariadne led them to the convoy of carriages that was waiting for them. As they approached the carriages, Robert halted in his steps as he looked up and saw the massive creature flying overhead. It was one of the dragons assigned to protect the city and its rider performing a patrol of the city, mixed in with improving public opinion. The Imperial Knights were all used to seeing and being near dragons, so they weren't as affected as Robert and his royal entourage, with some whispering prayers under their breath. "Seven hells," Robert muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of his sword. "When the name of the gods is that." "That," Ariadne said, "is one of the city's dragons. You are fortunate to see one of them up close, King Robert. From my understanding, a dragon hasn't been seen in Westeros for more than 100 years. Robert stared at the dragon in disbelief, his eyes following its movements as it soared through the sky. Its scales shimmered, catching the sunlight with every flap of its massive wings. The creature exuded an aura of majesty and power that was impossible to ignore. 100 years is too short if you ask me, he muttered under his breath. Beasts like that don't belong in the world of men. Jaime, standing at his side, was less inclined to dismiss what he saw. His sharp eyes analyzed the dragon's movements, the coordination between the creature and its rider. If that's just one of their city's defenders, I wonder what their greatest dragons look like. Ariadne's replied with a smile. Perhaps you will find out, said Jaime. Heaven's reach has many wonders, but its greatest lies at its heart. Cersei, with her gaze still fixed on the sky, finally spoke. Your emperor commands such creatures, and yet he allows Westeros to remain free? Curious. There was a hint of cautiousness in her tone, as if she couldn't decide whether to be impressed or wary. Ariadne turned to her to answer her question. The Imperial Union seeks stability, not conquest. The Emperor's strength is not wielded recklessly. Peace through power, Queen Cersei. That is the foundation of our empire. Robert let out a bark of laughter, though there was little humor in it. Peace through power. Sounds more like submission to me. Instead of answering her, Ariadne gestured toward the carriages. Shall we? The journey to Heaven's reach is long, and I assure you, King Robert, you'll have ample opportunity to form your own opinions of our empire. Robert climbed into the lead carriage, with Cersei following close behind and the rest of the royal entourage boarding their own. The king's guards were given horses and took their positions in an escort position around the convoy. Once everything was ready, they departed for the long journey. The trip to Heaven's Reach was smooth, as any bandits or other thugs knew not to mess with the Imperial Knights. Any carriage or convoy protected by the Imperial Knights was steered clear of, as the Knights had earned a certain reputation for hunting down those who attacked them. Their aura of authority and fighting prowess was enough to unnerve even the most hardened of hooligans. Throughout the journey, Robert was clearly restless, taking breaks often to get out of the carriage and stretch his legs. He grumbled about the tedium of travel, but he also seemed inclined to spend more time outside with the guards and stuck in the carriage with Cersei. Cersei, on the other hand, remained quietly composed for most parts. She occasionally got out to talk with Ariadne and inquire more about the imperial city. She was particularly interested in the daily activities of its citizens, the grandeur of the emperor's castle, and the magic that she had heard so many rumors about. Conversations between Ariadne and Cersei took place mostly at night, under a sky filled with bright stars. During these quiet moments, Ariadne would share stories of the Imperial Union, painting vivid pictures of bustling marketplaces, lavish balls, and citizens from multiple realms living under one rule. There's a unique beauty in diversity, Ariadne said one evening as she poured Cersei another cup of wine. Heaven's Reach has become home to so many different cultures and races. There are tensions at times, yes, but there's also a sense of unity. Cersei sipped on her wine slowly, a thoughtful look on her face. She found it hard to imagine such unity. Westeros was divided amongst houses seeking power and influence, each with their own agendas. Peace among these houses seemed as elusive as dragon's eggs in present-day Westeros. Meanwhile, Robert relished his time with the guards and knights. He tested their mettle with friendly sparring matches and his tales of hunting and war. The Imperial Knights themselves only needed to wait a few more days before they could be relieved of this annoyance. Once they reached Heaven's Reach, the capital, they were in awe. Entering from the eastern gate of the city, known as the Gate of Thousand Summers, Ariadne began to point out and explain things as they went by them. This gate is known as the Gate of Thousand Summers to reference that this gate and the city will stand for 1,000 summers, explained Ariadne, her finger pointing to the massive gate, which had intricate carvings telling the story of the city, was established by hundreds of thousands of workers. Beyond the gate, stretched out before them, was Heaven's Reach in all its glory. Houses of all sizes and shapes sprawled out as far as the eye could see. Towers reached high into the sky. Dragons flew high above in formations patrolling the city from the skies. While normal city guards, who were a mix of Roman legionaries, Spartan hoplites, and regular train guards, Robert and Cersei, who had been silent, now had expressions of astonishment. In King's Landing, the city guard consisted of the gold cloaks, while the king and other members of the royal family were protected by the King's Guard. Here, however, the city guards were a little different than they had in King's Landing. As you can see, the city guard are well-trained soldiers who have been given the training and weapons needed to enforce law and order throughout the city by order of His Excellency, Ariadne explained. Pretty much the same as the gold cloaks, Robert added from his understanding. Listening to and looking at the city guard, they may look and dress differently than the gold cloaks, but they still receive the training and necessary tools needed to enforce the law. Actually, Ariadne started, the city guard is different from the gold cloaks of King's Landing, as the gold cloaks are merely men who were chosen for their loyalty rather than their combat abilities. Our city guards, however, are selected based on their martial skills and undergo intensive training under the guidance of the Imperial Knights. Ariadne had more to say regarding how corrupt the gold cloaks were, but she kept that part to herself. They continued through Heaven's Reach, passing by the grand fountains and monuments that celebrated Maximus's victories against slavery. One statue had a slave master lying dead at Maximus's feet. Each thing they saw was more impressive than the last, leaving Cersei and Robert in a constant state of awe. Even Jaime managed to keep his critical retort to himself as they passed a fountain made entirely of precious gemstones. After riding for nearly half an hour, the convoy finally arrived at the gate leading to the palace. This is when Robert and Cersei almost freaked out over what they saw. A giant standing as tall as the gate itself had grabbed their attention. Jaime, who was riding on his horse, was stunned, unable to believe that the figure standing in front of him was real. The royal guards guarding the gate, after confirming the identity of the convoy, opened the gate, allowing the convoy to enter the palace grounds. Riding through the palace grounds, the convoy finally came to a stop near the entrance of the actual palace where Maximus resided. Disembarking from the carriages, the royal entourage was escorted into the palace with the King's Guard being able to keep their weapons. As they entered the throne room, there was already a gathering of people, as a major criminal was just arrested for some very serious crimes. Robert, Cersei, and the rest of the royal entourage were led to some seats while the proceeding began. Today, His Excellency, Maximus Invictus, will pass judgment upon Gernot Sanel for his crimes, which include leading a criminal organization within Imperial territory, the kidnapping and raping of more than 20 victims between the ages of 11-17. The list went on until the announcer finished the last crime. Not even sitting on his throne, but sitting on one of the stairs leading up to the throne, Maximus had an apple in one hand and a knife in the other as he began to cut pieces of the apple for himself to eat. Instead of his normal calm demeanor, he was extremely frustrated and angry at the person in front of him. In addition to King Robert and his royal entourage, the families of the victims were also present within the throne room, sitting down along the sides in their seats. They've been quiet, holding back their tears for the things that the emperor has done for them. After finding all the victims who were kidnapped, the families received support from the Imperial Union with compensation and counseling. A few of the victims have started to recover, but some still carried haunted looks in their eyes. The court was silent as the announcer finished reading the charges. Maximus tossed the apple core aside, his eyes now resting coldly on Gernot Sanel, who was knelt before him, hands bound in chains and mouth gagged. Gernot was from Myr and had traveled to Heaven's Reach after Myr was captured some years ago. After seeing how prosperous and free Heaven's Reach was, he wanted to exploit the city. Heaven's Reach, Maximus began, his voice echoing through the Grand Hall, does not tolerate the exploitation of its people. I do not tolerate the exploitation of my people. It's people like you who ruin it for others. Maximus rose from his stairs and approached Gernot, whose eyes widened as he saw the tall figure standing over him. Turning towards a guard standing at a door, Maximus nodded. The guard opened the door, as two of the witch elves had come out with big smiles on their face. They already knew what was about to happen. Gernot is hereby sentenced to death. However, his death will not be peaceful, nor will it be in any way humane. He will come to regret his actions as he basks in the cost of his sins. Which elves, you may proceed, Maximus declared, stepping back. He motioned for the guards to escort Robert and his entourage to another room. However, Jaime wanted to stay and see what was going to happen to the man. In another room, Robert and Cersei had sat across from Maximus as their first official face-to-face meeting. Maximus leaned back in his chair as a maid poured a glass of red wine for each of them. "I trust your journey here was uneventful," Maximus said as a formality from one ruler to another. No matter how much he disliked Robert's character or the things he has done, he has a certain type of outlook to uphold. Robert, still recovering from the number of things that he has seen in the past few hours, straightened up in his seat. "Uneventful, yes," he said gruffly, "though your city is impressive." His words were genuine, yet he still had the pride of a king struggling to acknowledge something greater than King's Landing. In her head, Cersei wondered what she did wrong to get married to somebody like Robert. Their relationship had been deteriorating ever since Robert called her Lyanna on their wedding night. Heaven's Reach is unlike anything we've ever seen. She gave Maximus a smile, one which Robert didn't see. "It speaks volumes of your abilities, your excellency." Maximus returned the smile with a nod. "Thank you, Queen Cersei. A lot has been invested in it. You should see the Academy District tomorrow. I think you will find it as impressive as even the Citadel in Old Town." "I'm sure I will," replied Cersei. From there, the conversation was mainly about how King Robert could strengthen the ties between Westeros and the Imperial Union. He believed that Westeros had a lot to offer the Imperial Union and vice versa. Though sometime during the conversion, Robert also brought up the Targaryens, who were being kept safe by Maximus. It was a touchy topic where Robert lets his emotions out a little whenever he's talking about it. Maximus knew this was coming as Robert had a strong hate for the Targaryens, which had only amplified due to how many he let get away. Fortunately, he didn't allow his emotions to completely take over and recognize that he was not in King's Landing before things made a turn for the worse. After their talk, Robert and Cersei were escorted to where they would be staying during their week's visit. The criminal Girano, on the other hand, would be tortured and brought to the brink of death before being healed, only for the process to restart again. This would happen for 20 long days until the final day when he would be publicly executed. Waking up the next day, Maximus invited the royal family for breakfast. It was only Robert and Cersei, as Joffrey was only 5, and they had decided against bringing him on the long journey to Essos. For breakfast, since King Robert loved to drink, Maximus had some of their best wine brought for him along with a number of assorted cheeses and meats. Cersei looked at the food in front of them with a smile on her face and began to taste the various delicacies. The day outside was bright and sunny, light shining through the palace's windows and lighting up the dining hall. Robert, for some reason, was in a good mood early in the morning as he had a good night's sleep. The bed he was sleeping on was so comfortable that he fell asleep almost instantly after his head hit his pillow. Sometime before he left, he planned to ask Maximus how much he would take for the entire bed. Maximus took a seat opposite them, accompanied by Merlin and Lilith, who took the seats on each side of him. "King Robert, this is Merlin, my assistant." Merlin slightly bowed her head towards Robert and Cersei. Maximus then introduced Lilith. "And this is Lilith, the leader of the witches." Lilith slightly bowed her head as well. Looking between Merlin and Lilith, Robert started to think that maybe he was born on the wrong side of the world. In this place, so far, everything that he has seen is better than anything they had in Westeros. From the cities, to the soldiers, to the woman, and then the wine, this place was built for him and wish he didn't have to leave. However, he was stuck being the king of the 7 kingdoms, a position which he was excited about at first because of power and authority, but now he is starting to dislike the responsibilities of being the king, which is the reason why he left most things to his hand, Jon Arryn, and rarely attended the small council meetings. He much preferred to indulge in the other benefits that came with being a king. "Nice to meet you two lovely ladies," Robert replied, raising his cup full of wine and a toast. "And please pass my compliments to your cooks. The breakfast is amazing." Cersei said the same, as the food was 5 times better than what she had in King's Landing. She had also become quite interested in the two ladies sitting next to the emperor. They both had this type of aura around them which grabbed her attention. She tried to keep her eyes on her food, but she kept looking up as both Merlin and Lilith were laughing and giggling as they fed the emperor. She looked over at Robert and sighed as he was gobbling down his breakfast without a care in the world. She wished they did more things like feeding each other, if only their relationship wasn't torn apart and only held together for the sake of the realm. Merlin noticed Cersei occasionally gazing at them and came up with an interesting plan. Cersei, how about me and Lilith take you out into the city today and leave the men to do what men do? She asked. I think that would be wonderful, Cersei replied. A day away from Robert was something she would never pass up. All right, then after breakfast we're going to go into the city. Hearing Merlin's proposal, Maximus looked at Robert, thinking of what they could do together. They could go and watch the games in the Colosseum or the horse racing in the stadium. Yes, let's allow the ladies to enjoy the city, Maximus agreed. Meanwhile, we can enjoy some entertainment of our own. How does the prospect of a Colosseum contest sound? King Robert. Robert practically lit up as he slapped his hand down on the table. Now, that is my kind of entertainment, he declared enthusiastically. He was still grinning from ear to ear as he downed his cup of wine. Cersei bit her lip slightly as she watched Robert interact with the emperor. Her husband wasn't exactly the most diplomatic man. He was more likely to solve disputes with a warhammer than words, and she found herself holding her breath whenever he was required to actually converse with someone. As Robert and Maximus devolved into discussing various competitive sports and grown men hurling each other around a sandpit, Merlin, Lilith, and Cersei had excused themselves. Cersei found herself being led away by Lilith and Merlin, out into the bustling streets of Heaven's Reach. Accompanying them were 10 Imperial guards, escorting them throughout the city. The trio wandered through the streets of Heaven's Reach, attracting attention from all who passed by. Merlin and Lilith were well known throughout the Imperial Union, as they held high positions under Maximus and often engaged with the public. Quite an impressive city, Cersei remarked as they made their way through Market Square, her eyes looking at the bustling scene in front of her, traders haggling over prices, children running around and playing, and the occasional street performer drawing a crowd with their dances or physical prowess. I can't help but wonder how you manage to maintain order in such a place. Merlin chuckled lightly. The Imperial Union has its own way of managing affairs, she said. We have a meritocratic system in place and numerous institutions for advanced learning. It results in our citizens having a deep respect for law and order. Cersei nodded, trying to understand the differences between King's Landing and Heaven's Reach. In King's Landing and Westeros in general, the general population were not considered and often ignored, with power focused only on the royal and noble houses. But here in Heaven's Reach, it was vastly different. The people seemed content and peaceful. It was something new for her. And how about you? Lilith asked. How do you find life as the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms? It's complicated, Cersei admitted as she picked up a silver necklace from one of the stalls, examining it under the sunlight. As you can see, the king is not quite as invested as he should be. I see, Lilith nodded. Well, perhaps our time here can provide you with some peace away from royal duties. As they continued to explore the city, Merlin and Lilith shared more about their experiences. Meanwhile, Robert and Maximus, joined by Ianwe, made their way to the viewing platform overlooking the Colosseum Stadium below. The games had begun a little after they arrived, cheering crowds watching as gladiators clashed against each other in a ballet of bloodshed and brutality. The loud cheering of the crowds filled the air, the scene of sweaty and bloodied men fighting for honor, glory, and sometimes just survival reminded Robert of a time before his kingship, a time when he too was driven by glory and honor, where the battlefield was his canvas. He reveled in the carnage, his laughter louder than the shouts of the frenzied crowd. These gladiators, they fight to the death? Robert asked. In certain circumstances, Maximus replied, sipping from his cup as he watched the spectacle below. But typically, we value life more than a cheap thrill. They fight for honor, for glory. The defeated get another chance to regain their honor in future matches. Robert chuckled deeply, leaning heavily on the barrier's edge as he observed the fights fascinatedly. Much like our tourneys then, despite his view of Westeros and Robert as a person, he had to admit that Robert had a great sense of humor. For the next week, Maximus spent time with Robert and Cersei, oftentimes discussing the governing methods of Heaven's Reach, taking them on tours around the city, showing them key institutions that held the empire together, the academies, research institutions, trade centers, and military barracks. They also discussed various other opportunities where Westeros nobles could send their children to study in Heaven's Reach. The deal would allow nobles to be granted property, which they have to pay a monthly sum for. In return, their children would receive an education far superior to what was available in Westeros. Maximus thought about the proposition and told Robert that he would have to get back to him another day on that matter. And since Robert and Cersei were leaving, he would send a messenger whenever he had an answer for them. Boarding their convoy, Robert and Cersei set out for Pentos, where they boarded their ship and finally left for King's Landing.